What would you do if you stopped in a small Oregon town and realized no one was going to let you leave? Welcome back to the Haunted Fears horror family. Tonight, 11 disturbing events from Oregon's most isolated towns, places where fog rolls in thick, where everyone knows everyone, and outsiders are never welcome. Some of these people made it out, some didn't, and some are still trying to figure out if they ever really left. Hit subscribe and join the Haunted Fears horror family. Let's get into it. What would you do if you were stranded in a coastal town where every single resident suddenly gathered at midnight for a ritual you weren't supposed to witness, and you realized you were the only outsider left? That's exactly what happened to Rebecca in Depoe Bay, Oregon, and she still doesn't know if she truly escaped. Rebecca never planned to stay in Depoe Bay overnight. The town is barely a dot on the map, famous for having the world's smallest harbor and not much else. She was driving down Highway 101 from Portland, heading to Coos Bay for a work conference the next morning. It was already past 8 p.m. when her car started making a grinding noise just as she passed the Depoe Bay city limits sign. The check engine light blazed orange on her dashboard. She pulled into the only gas station she could find, but it was closed. Everything looked closed. The fog was rolling in thick from the Pacific, turning the streetlights into hazy orange globes that barely penetrated 10 feet. Rebecca sat in her car for a moment, debating whether to risk driving further or find somewhere to wait until morning. That's when she noticed the diner across the street, its neon open sign flickering weakly through the mist. The spouting horn. Diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Red vinyl booths, checkered floor tiles, a long counter with chrome-edged stools. When Rebecca pushed through the door, a bell chimed, and every head in the place turned to look at her. There were maybe 15 people scattered throughout the diner, and they all stopped their conversations at exactly the same moment to stare. "Hi," Rebecca said, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up her spine. "My car broke down. Is there a mechanic in town who might still be available?" The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, smiled too widely. "Oh, honey, nothing's open this time of night, but don't you worry. We'll take care of you. Sit anywhere you like." Rebecca chose a booth near the window so she could keep an eye on her car. The waitress brought her coffee without asking, and a laminated menu that looked decades old. The prices were impossibly low, $2 for a burger, 50 cents for coffee. Rebecca checked her phone. No signal. Of course there wasn't. "You just passing through?" the waitress asked, lingering by Rebecca's table. "Yeah, heading to Coos Bay. Hopefully I can get my car looked at in the morning." "Oh, you'll definitely be staying the night then," the waitress said, and something about the way she emphasized "definitely" made Rebecca's stomach tighten. "We have a room above the diner. Used to be a hotel back in the day. You're welcome to it. No charge." Rebecca wanted to refuse, but the fog outside had thickened to the point where she could barely see her car anymore. The idea of sleeping in her vehicle in this weather didn't appeal to her. "That's very kind. Thank you." The waitress's smile grew even wider. "We take care of our guests in Depoe Bay. Always have." Rebecca ordered a burger and fries, mostly because she felt obligated. While she waited, she noticed the other diners were having strange conversations. They spoke in low murmurs, but occasionally she'd catch fragments. Someone mentioned the tide. Another person said, "when the bells start." A man in a fishing jacket kept checking his watch and nodding to himself. The food arrived quickly, and it tasted fine, though Rebecca had little appetite. She ate mechanically, watching the fog press against the windows like something alive. By the time she finished, the diner had filled up. More people had arrived, all locals by the looks of them, all wearing that same too-friendly expression. They kept glancing at her, then quickly looking away when she met their eyes. "Ready to see your room?" the waitress asked, appearing at Rebecca's elbow so suddenly she flinched. The room upstairs was accessed through a narrow staircase at the back of the diner. It was small but clean, with a single bed, a nightstand, and a window overlooking the street. Or it would have overlooked the street if the fog wasn't so thick. Rebecca couldn't see anything beyond the glass except whiteness. "Bathroom's down the hall," the waitress said. "And honey, best to stay in your room after midnight. The town gets active." Before Rebecca could ask what that meant, the waitress was gone, her footsteps creaking back down the stairs. Rebecca locked the door, though the lock looked flimsy, and sat on the bed. It was only 9:30 p.m. She tried her phone again. Still no signal. She tried to tell herself this was just a quirky small town, that people in isolated places were always a bit odd, that she was being paranoid. She wasn't paranoid enough. At 11:45 p.m., Rebecca was lying on the bed fully clothed, trying to convince herself to sleep, when she heard the bells. They weren't church bells exactly. The sound was deeper, resonating in a way that made her bones vibrate. She went to the window and wiped the condensation from the glass. The fog had thinned slightly, and what she saw made her blood go cold. People were emerging from every building on the street, dozens of them, maybe more. They all carried lanterns, the old-fashioned kind with candles inside, and they were walking in a silent procession toward the harbor. The waitress was there, the diners from earlier, the man in the fishing jacket, all of them. Rebecca watched, transfixed, as they disappeared into the fog, heading toward the sound of crashing waves. The bells continued, rhythmic and hypnotic. She should have stayed in her room. The waitress had warned her. But something pulled her toward the door, a curiosity that overrode her fear. She crept downstairs, avoiding the steps that creaked. The diner was empty now, abandoned mid-shift. Coffee pots still warmed on their burners. Half-eaten, meals sat on tables. It was as if everyone had simply stood up and walked out at the same moment. Rebecca stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately, carrying the salt smell of the ocean and something else, something organic and ancient. She followed the direction the townspeople had gone, staying in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. The harbor at Depoe Bay really was the smallest she'd ever seen, just a narrow channel carved into the rocks where the ocean surged through. The townspeople had gathered on both sides of the channel, their lanterns creating a corridor of flickering light. They stood in absolute silence, facing the water. Rebecca hid behind a parked truck, watching. The bells had stopped, replaced by a sound she couldn't quite identify. It was like singing, but not in any language she recognized. The words were guttural, rhythmic, rising and falling with the waves. The townspeople were chanting in unison, their voices blending into something that sounded less like human speech, and more like the ocean itself had learned to speak. Then she saw the waitress turn, slowly, deliberately, until she was looking directly at Rebecca's hiding spot. The woman smiled, but it wasn't friendly anymore. It was knowing. It was hungry. "She's watching," the waitress called out, her voice cutting through the chanting. "The guest is watching." Every single person turned to look at Rebecca. Dozens of faces, their eyes reflecting the lantern light like animals caught in headlights. The chanting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Rebecca ran. She didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted back toward the diner. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Not running, just walking at that same steady, implacable pace. They didn't need to run. They knew she had nowhere to go. She reached her car and yanked the door open. The keys were still in the ignition. She turned them, praying to anything that would listen, and by some miracle the engine coughed to life. The grinding noise was louder than before, but the car moved. Rebecca slammed her foot on the accelerator and tore out of the parking lot. In her rearview mirror, she saw the townspeople standing in the street, their lanterns held high, watching her go. They weren't chasing her. They were just standing there, as if they'd known all along she would run, as if they'd expected it. The fog closed around her car like a fist. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, couldn't tell if she was even on the road anymore. Her GPS was useless, spinning in confused circles. She drove for what felt like hours, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, expecting at any moment to see those lanterns appear through the mist. When the fog finally thinned and she saw the sign for Lincoln City, Rebecca pulled over and sobbed with relief. She made it to her conference. Though she couldn't concentrate on anything, she told people her car had broken down, that she'd had to wait for a tow truck. She didn't mention Depoe Bay. A week later, curiosity got the better of her. She looked up the Spouting Horn Diner online. There was no record of it. No restaurant by that name in Depoe Bay, current or historical. She found travel blogs about the town, but none of them mentioned a diner with rooms above it. She even called the Depoe Bay Chamber of Commerce, asking about places to stay. They listed 3 hotels, none of them above a restaurant. Rebecca tried to tell herself she'd been on a different street, in a different town, but she checked her credit card statement, and there was no charge for the meal she'd eaten. She checked her odometer, and the miles didn't match up. She'd driven farther than should have been possible in the time she was on the road. The worst part came 3 months later. Rebecca was scrolling through social media when she saw a post from someone she'd gone to college with. The woman was visiting the Oregon coast and had posted a photo from Depoe Bay. In the background of the image, barely visible through fog, was a neon sign, the Spouting Horn Diner. Rebecca messaged her immediately. "Did you go inside that diner?" The reply came an hour later. "What diner? There's nothing like that here. It's just a bunch of gift shops and whale-watching places." But Rebecca had seen the sign in the photo. She'd zoomed in, enhanced the image, stared at it until her eyes burned. The diner was there. The open sign was flickering in the same weak, dying way she remembered. She never drove down Highway 101 again. She took inland routes, added hours to her trips, did anything to avoid passing through Depoe Bay. But sometimes, late at night, she hears bells. They're faint, distant, like they're coming from somewhere she can't quite reach. And she wonders if she really escaped that night, or if some part of her is still there, watching the townspeople walk to the harbor with their lanterns, waiting for the next guest to arrive. Because in Depoe Bay, they take care of their guests. They always have. And once you've been a guest, you never really leave. Imagine waking up in the same moment over and over in a ghost town hotel, watching your room age a century around you, and realizing you might be trapped in someone else's final night from 120 years ago. That's what happened to Grady when he decided to spend one night in Shaniko, Oregon's most isolated ghost town. Grady was an urban explorer with a YouTube channel that had maybe 300 subscribers on a good day. He filmed abandoned places, narrating in hushed tones about the history, while his camera captured crumbling walls and debris-strewn floors. Shaniko was supposed to be his big break. A real ghost town in central Oregon with a population of 36 people and an operating hotel from 1900 that still took guests. The place was legendary among Urbex's communities. He arrived at sunset, his truck kicking up dust on the empty main street. Shaniko looked frozen in time. The old schoolhouse stood with boarded windows. The historic city hall sat silent. And there, dominating the skyline, was the Shaniko Hotel, a massive 2-story structure with peeling paint and a wraparound porch that seemed to sag under its own weight. The woman at the front desk was ancient, her skin like parchment, her eyes milky with cataracts. She didn't ask for a credit card, just cash, and slid him an actual metal key attached to a heavy wooden fob. "Room 214. Breakfast is at 7, she said, in a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Don't wander the halls after midnight." Grady smiled, thinking it was part of the ghost town charm, some attempt to add atmosphere for the tourists. "Why's that?" She didn't smile back. "Because the hotel doesn't like it." Now, his room was exactly what he'd expected. Antique furniture, a brass bed frame, floral wallpaper that had probably been installed during the Eisenhower administration. The radiator clanked and hissed in the corner. There was no television, no phone, just a washstand with a porcelain basin and a window that looked out over the empty town. Grady spent the first few hours filming everything. The creaky floorboards, the old light fixtures, the way his shadow moved strangely on the walls in the lamplight. He recorded his intro explaining Shaniko's history as a wool shipping hub that died when the railroad bypassed it in 1911. The hotel had been closed for decades, reopened, closed again, reopened. It had cycled through death and resurrection so many times that maybe it forgot which state it was supposed to be in. He went to bed around 11 p.m., setting his phone alarm for sunrise so he could capture the town in early morning light. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender and dust. Within minutes, he was asleep. Grady woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. He checked his phone. 3:17 a.m. The footsteps didn't move. Someone was standing there, just on the other side of the thin wood, breathing. He could hear the breath, low and ragged. "Hello," Grady called out, his voice embarrassingly shaky. The breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. Grady sat up, heart pounding, and decided this was perfect content for his channel. He grabbed his camera and crept to the door, opening it slowly. The hallway was empty. Old sconce lights flickered, casting dancing shadows, but there was no one there. Grady filmed for a few minutes, narrating in a whisper about the mysterious footsteps, then went back to bed. He checked his phone again. 3:19 a.m. He'd been awake for maybe 5 minutes total. He closed his eyes and fell back into sleep almost immediately. Grady woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. His hand reached automatically for his phone. 3:17 a.m. Wait. He sat up, confusion fogging his thoughts. This had already happened. He'd already heard these footsteps. But his phone said 3:17 a.m., exactly like before. The breathing started on the other side of the door, low and ragged, exactly like before. "This isn't funny," Grady shouted, but even as he said it, he knew something was wrong. This didn't feel like a prank. This felt like déjà vu, except too perfect, too exact. He didn't go to the door this time. He sat frozen in bed, listening as the footsteps eventually moved away. Then he grabbed his phone and tried to call someone, anyone. No signal. He tried the hotel Wi-Fi. No connection found. He opened his camera roll and scrolled to the video he'd just taken of the empty hallway. It wasn't there. His last video was his room tour from earlier that evening. Grady's hands started shaking. He turned on all the lights and sat on the bed staring at the door, waiting for morning. His eyes felt heavy. The radiator's rhythmic clanking was hypnotic. He tried to fight it, but sleep pulled him under like a tide. Grady woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. Phone, 3:17 a.m. Breathing, low and ragged. "No, no, no, no," he whispered, scrambling backward on the bed until his back hit the headboard. This was the third time. The exact same moment, the exact same sounds, the exact same time on his phone. But something was different now. The wallpaper. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The floral pattern was peeling at the edges, curling away from the wall in ways it hadn't been before. And the color was different, faded, like it had aged years in the minutes since he'd last been awake. The footsteps moved away. Grady jumped out of bed and ran to the mirror above the washstand. His reflection looked back at him, wide-eyed and terrified, but the mirror itself was different. The glass was more tarnished, spotted with age. The washstand's porcelain had a crack that definitely hadn't been there before. He looked around the room with growing horror. The brass bed frame was duller, the metal showing patina. The floorboards were more warped. Even his duffel bag looked older. The fabric faded, the zipper corroded. Grady tried the door. It opened easily. The hallway outside was empty, but it too looked different. The carpet was more threadbare, the wallpaper more damaged. Some of the sconce lights were completely dark now, their bulbs dead or missing. He ran down the hallway to the stairs, taking them two at a time, and burst into the lobby. It was empty. The old woman was gone. The front desk was covered in a thick layer of dust. When Grady ran to the front doors and pushed, they wouldn't budge. They weren't locked. They were sealed, as if painted shut or swollen with moisture and age. He ran back upstairs, back to his room, and slammed the door. He pulled out his phone and tried everything. Emergency calls, Wi-Fi, airplane mode, on and off. Nothing worked. The battery was at 47%, same as it had been at 3:17 a.m. the first time he woke up. Grady wedged a chair under the doorknob and sat on the bed, determined to stay awake. He pinched himself, bit his lip, did jumping jacks. But the room's air was thick and heavy. The radiator's clanking became a lullaby. His eyelids drooped despite every effort to keep them open. Grady woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. Phone, 3:17 a.m. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he looked around the room. The wallpaper was hanging in strips. The floorboards were rotted in places, showing darkness beneath. The bed frame was so tarnished, it was nearly black. His duffel bag had fallen apart, its contents spilling onto a floor that was now covered in dust and debris. Fourth loop. Fourth time waking to the same moment. And the room was aging decades with each cycle. The breathing started outside the door. Grady couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the old desk chair and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and cold night air rushed in. He ran to the opening and looked down. The drop was only about 15 feet. He could make it. But when he looked at the town below, he staggered backward. Shaniko wasn't there. Not the Shaniko he'd driven into. This was older, much older. The street was dirt, not paved. There were different buildings, ones he'd never seen. And there were people, dozens of them, walking around in clothes from another century. Horse-drawn carriages moved past. Oil lamps burned in windows. Grady was looking at Shaniko from 1900. The footsteps in the hallway moved away, but this time they were followed by a sound he hadn't heard before. A woman's scream, cut short. Then a heavy thud, like something falling. He stood frozen, listening. Silence. Then footsteps again, but different ones, lighter, running. They came down the hallway and stopped at his door. The doorknob turned slowly. "Don't come in," Grady whispered. "Please don't come. In." The door opened anyway. The chair he'd wedged under the knob was gone, rotted away in the room's accelerated aging. Standing in the doorway was a woman in a long white nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was translucent, not quite solid, and she was staring at the bed. At him, but not at him. At something else, someone else. Grady looked at the bed, and his scream lodged in his throat. There was someone in it, a figure lying under the covers, sleeping, and he recognized the shape, the build. It was him. He was looking at himself, but dressed in clothes he didn't own, night clothes from 1900. The ghost woman moved into the room, gliding rather than walking, her eyes fixed on the sleeping figure. She reached out with translucent hands and touched the figure's face. The figure's eyes opened. They were Grady's eyes, but older, haunted, filled with a terror that had been building for years. "Please," the figure in the bed whispered. "Not again, please, not again." The ghost woman leaned down and whispered something Grady couldn't hear. The figure in the bed began to scream. Grady backed toward the broken window, his mind fracturing. He was watching his own death, or someone's death. Someone who looked exactly like him. Someone who had been trapped here, living this same night over and over until it drove them insane. The room began to shake. The floor buckled. The walls started collapsing inward. And Grady understood with sudden, horrible clarity. He wasn't going to escape this loop. He was going to live it over and over, each time waking at 3:17 a.m., each time watching the room age another century, until eventually he became the thing in the bed, the permanent resident, the ghost who'd been here so long he'd forgotten any other existence. Grady ran to the window and jumped. He woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. Phone, 3:17 a.m. Fifth loop. The walls were completely bare now, the wallpaper gone. The floor was mostly holes. The bed was a rusted frame, and in the corner, he saw something he hadn't seen before. A shape. A person. Someone sitting in the shadows watching him. "Who are you?" Grady asked, though he already knew. He knew because he recognized the clothes. The same clothes he'd been wearing when he checked in. The same clothes that were now rotted and ancient on this figure's body. The figure stood and stepped into the lamplight that somehow still worked despite everything else failing. It was him. Grady's own face, but wrong, older. Exhausted. Eyes that had seen this same night thousands of times. "You'll understand eventually," his other self said, in a voice rough with disuse. "This is room 214. This is where Sarah died in 1902. Her husband killed her at exactly 3:17 a.m., and the hotel remembered. It keeps trying to relive that night, pulling in anyone who stays here, trapping them in her final hours." "How long have you been here?" Grady whispered. "I checked in 3 days ago," the figure said. "Or 3 years, or 3 centuries. Time doesn't work right anymore. Each loop ages the room, but it resets eventually, goes back to 2025, and then starts over. And we're stuck in it, you and me, watching it happen again and again." "We?" Grady asked. "Room 214 can hold multiple guests," the figure said, with a horrible smile. "And it likes to keep us all." The footsteps in the hallway moved away. The woman's scream cut through the walls. The heavy thud followed. Grady felt his eyes growing heavy despite his terror. The sleep was coming whether he wanted it or not. The loop demanded it. "How do we get out?" he asked desperately. "We don't," his other self said, already fading back into the shadows. "We just become part of the hotel's collection. Another ghost, another echo. Eventually you'll forget you were ever anything else." Grady's eyes closed. He tried to fight it, tried to stay awake, but the pull was impossible to resist. He woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. His phone was gone now, rotted into the floor. He didn't need it anyway. He knew what time it was. He would always know what time it was. 3:17 a.m. Forever. What would you do if the hitchhiker you picked up out of kindness turned out to be the very legend locals warned you about, and your car suddenly wouldn't let you escape? That's what happened to Veronica on a dark stretch of Highway 101 near Cannon Beach, and she's never driven that road again. Veronica had always prided herself on being practical, level-headed, the kind of person who didn't believe in ghost stories or urban legends. She was driving home from a wedding in Astoria, heading south on Highway 101 toward Portland around 11 p.m. The reception had run late, and she'd had exactly 1 glass of champagne 3 hours earlier, so she felt perfectly fine to drive. The road was empty, just her headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional glimpse of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the rocks to her right. She was passing through a particularly desolate stretch near Cannon Beach when she saw him. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road, arm extended, thumb out. The classic hitchhiker pose. As her headlights swept over him, she saw he was covered in what looked like bandages, wrapped around his head, his arms, his torso visible through a torn shirt. Blood stained the white fabric in dark patches. Veronica's first instinct was to keep driving. Every true crime podcast she'd ever listened to screamed at her to keep going. Don't stop. Don't be stupid. But the humanitarian in her, the part that had spent 2 years in the Peace Corps, that volunteered at homeless shelters, couldn't just leave someone who was clearly injured on the side of a dark highway. She pulled over about 20 feet past him and put on her hazard lights. Through her rear-view mirror, she watched him approach. His gait was strange, shuffling, but that made sense if he was hurt. She rolled down her passenger window halfway as he reached the door. "Are you okay?" she called out. "Do you need me to call an ambulance?" He didn't answer. just stood there, breathing heavily, the bandages around his face moving slightly with each exhale. Up close, she could see the bandages were old, yellowed, like they'd been on for days. The blood looked dried and brown in places, fresh and red in others. "I can take you to a hospital," Veronica tried again. "Seaside has an ER. It's only about 15 minutes north." The figure raised one bandaged hand and pointed forward, down the highway south. His finger was insistent, almost aggressive in its gesture. "You want to go south?" Veronica asked. "There's nothing for miles that way except—" He pulled the door handle. It was unlocked. Before Veronica could react, he slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him a smell that made her gag. It was a mixture of rot, salt water, and something chemical, like formaldehyde. He pointed forward again, more insistently. Okay, Veronica said, her heart starting to race. This was a mistake. This was absolutely a mistake. But he was already in her car, and getting him out seemed more dangerous than just driving. She'd take him a few miles, drop him at the next town, and never do anything this stupid again. She pulled back onto Highway 101 and accelerated. The hitchhiker sat completely still, his bandaged hands resting on his knees, his head facing forward. Veronica tried not to look at him, focusing on the road, on the white lines illuminated by her headlights, on anything except the figure sitting 2 feet away from her. "So, what happened to you?" she asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. "Were you in an accident?" No response, just that heavy, labored breathing. "I'm Veronica, by the way. I'm coming from a wedding in Astoria. My friend Sarah got married. It was beautiful, right on the beach. Do you live around here?" Nothing. The breathing continued, steady and unsettling. Veronica reached for her phone, thinking she'd at least text someone, let them know what was happening. As soon as her fingers touched the phone in the center console, her car radio crackled to life, even though she hadn't turned it on. Static poured from the speakers, loud and aggressive, drowning out everything else. What the hell? Veronica reached for the volume knob and turned it down, but the static didn't change. She turned it all the way off, pressed the power button, but the static continued, unaffected by any of her attempts to silence it. She glanced at the hitchhiker. He had turned his head and was looking at her now. At least, she thought he was looking at her. The bandages covered where his eyes should be, but she could feel his gaze, heavy and focused, boring into the side of her face. "Look, I think maybe I should just pull over and—" That's when she noticed the bandages were moving, not from breathing. These were independent movements, like something underneath was shifting, writhing, trying to get out. She could see the fabric rippling across his torso, his arms, his face. Small bulges appeared and disappeared, as if dozens of fingers were pressing from the inside. Veronica's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Okay, you need to get out. Right now. I'm pulling over." She moved her foot to the brake pedal and pressed down. Nothing happened. The car continued at exactly 55 miles per hour, not slowing even a fraction. She pressed harder, standing on the pedal with all her weight. The car didn't respond. Panic flooding through her veins, Veronica yanked the steering wheel to the right, trying to pull onto the shoulder. The wheel didn't move. It was locked in place, as solid as if it had been welded to the column. She pulled with both hands, threw her whole body weight into it. The wheel remained perfectly straight, the car gliding down the highway as if on rails. "What's happening? What did you do?" Veronica screamed at the hitchhiker. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was wet, gurgling, like he was talking through a mouth full of liquid. "You should have kept driving past me like everyone else does." The bandages on his face began to unravel. Not fall off, but unravel themselves, peeling back layer by layer with deliberate slowness. Veronica didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Her eyes were drawn to the slow reveal of whatever was underneath. There was no face. Where his features should have been was just raw, glistening tissue that seemed to pulse and shift. But there were eyes. Too many eyes. They opened across the exposed flesh, Dozens of them, all sizes, all colors, blinking independently, and all focused on her. Veronica tried to open her door. The handle wouldn't budge. She pressed the unlock button. Nothing. She threw her shoulder against the door. It might as well have been a solid wall. The windows wouldn't roll down. The sunroof wouldn't open. Her car had become a sealed box, traveling at 55 miles per hour down a dark highway, with something that wasn't human sitting beside her. "Please," Veronica whispered. "Please, I just wanted to help you. I thought you were hurt." More of the bandages were unwrapping now, falling away to reveal more of that horrible eye-covered flesh. The eyes blinked and stared, blinked and stared, never looking away from her. The thing that had been the hitchhiker began to speak again, and this time his voice came from multiple places at once, as if several mouths were speaking in unison. "I am hurt. I've been hurt for a very long time, since 1960, since the accident on this very road, since my car went over the cliff and my body was wrapped in bandages by paramedics who couldn't save me, since I died with my eyes open, watching the ocean take me." The speedometer began to climb. 60, 65, 70. Veronica's foot wasn't on the gas pedal, but the car was accelerating on its own. "Every night I stand on this road," the thing continued. "Every night I wait for someone kind enough, foolish enough to stop. Someone who thinks they can help. Someone who doesn't listen to the warnings." The car was flying now, the dark highway blurring past, the white lines becoming a solid stream. "What do you want?" Veronica sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" All of the eyes blinked simultaneously. "I want you to see what I saw. I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to understand what it's like to lose control, to know you're going to die, and to be completely unable to stop it." The thing that had been a hitchhiker reached out with one bandaged hand and placed it on the dashboard. Where it touched, the plastic began to age rapidly, cracking and yellowing, falling apart into dust. The rot spread across the dashboard, down the console, across the seats. Veronica watched in horror as her car began to decay around her, aging decades in seconds. They were approaching a curve, a sharp turn where the highway bent along the cliff face. Veronica knew this curve. She'd driven it 100 times. You had to slow down to 45 or risk going over. "No, no, no, no," she chanted, pulling uselessly at the steering wheel, pressing the brake pedal that might as well not exist. "Please, I have a family. I have a daughter. Please don't do this." The thing's eyes all focused on her at once. In their depths, she saw pain, loneliness, rage, and an endless, empty hunger. "So did I," it whispered. "But the ocean doesn't care about families." The curve was coming up fast. Too fast. Impossibly fast. Veronica could see the guardrail, could see the drop beyond it, could see the rocks and the churning Pacific waiting below. She closed her eyes and screamed. The impact never came. Instead, she felt the car slow, smoothly, felt it navigate the curve with perfect precision, felt it come to a gentle stop on the shoulder, just past the turn. The static on the radio cut off abruptly. The steering wheel moved freely under her hands. The door locks clicked open. Veronica's eyes snapped open. She was alone in the car. The passenger seat was empty except for a dark, wet stain on the fabric and a smell that made her want to vomit. Her dashboard was intact, no decay, no damage. Her phone showed 11:47 p.m. She'd only been driving for 12 minutes. She scrambled out of the car and stood on the shoulder, gasping for air, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her car looked normal. Everything looked normal, except for that stain on the passenger seat and the smell that wouldn't leave her nostrils. Veronica got back in the car, locked all the doors, and drove home at exactly the speed limit, taking back roads to avoid Highway 101. She didn't stop again. Not for red lights that caught her at empty intersections. Not for the gas station when her tank hit empty but somehow kept going. Not for anything. The next day, she took her car to be detailed. The detailer called her 3 times, asking what had made the stain on the passenger seat. She told him she didn't know. He said he'd never seen anything like it, that it had soaked through the fabric into the cushion, into the metal frame beneath, as if it had been there for decades. Veronica traded in the car a week later and took a huge loss on it. She didn't care. She told the dealer there was nothing wrong with it, and technically there wasn't. It ran fine. Everything worked. But she could still smell that chemical rotting smell every time she sat in the driver's seat. And sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she'd see bandages in the passenger seat slowly unwrapping. She looked up the legend after it happened, finally Googling Bandage Man, Oregon, in the safety of her apartment. The stories went back to the 1960s. A man in a truck wrapped in bloody bandages appearing on Highway 101, scaring drivers. Some said he was a logger who'd been in an accident. Some said he was a burn victim. Some said he was a ghost looking for revenge. But the stories that disturbed her most were the ones about the people who stopped to help him, the ones who picked him up. According to the forums and local legend sites, those people either never spoke about what happened or they were never seen again. There were 3 unsolved disappearances along that stretch of Highway 101 in the last 40 years. 3 people whose cars were found abandoned, doors open, engines still running, with dark stains on the passenger seats that couldn't be identified. Veronica should have been the 4th. She still doesn't know why she wasn't. Why the bandage man let her go. Sometimes she thinks maybe he didn't. Maybe she's still in that car, still accelerating toward the curve, and this life is just the dying dream of someone going over the cliff. She can't prove it's not. All she knows is that she never picks up hitchhikers anymore. Not on Highway 101, not anywhere. And when she drives the Oregon coast now, which she tries never to do, she keeps her eyes straight ahead, never looking at the shoulder, never looking at the empty spaces where someone might be standing with their thumb out, waiting for the next kind person to make a terrible mistake. Because in Oregon, some legends keep themselves alive by feeding on kindness. And the bandage man is always waiting, always patient, always hungry for one more ride. What would you do if you were trapped in cursed ruins that wouldn't release you until you spoke your worst secret out loud, and shadows on the walls started revealing what you're desperately trying to hide? Augustus learned the answer in Portland's Forest Park, and he's still trying to forget what he heard that night. The trail to the witch's castle wound through Douglas firs, so dense they choked out the afternoon sun. Augustus walked it alone, his boots crunching on fallen needles, his breath forming clouds in air that shouldn't have been this cold in October. He'd driven up from Eugene specifically for this, had researched the location for weeks, knew its history by heart. The Balch Creek Stone House, built 1850s, scene of Danford Balch's murder of his son-in-law in 1859, first legal hanging in Oregon. Abandoned, forgotten, perfect. He was a true crime writer working on a book about Pacific Northwest hauntings, and the witch's castle was supposed to be his centerpiece chapter. He'd interviewed locals, read newspaper archives, compiled decades of urban legends, but he needed to experience the place himself, needed to feel whatever lingered in those stones. His editor wanted authenticity. Augustus was determined to deliver it. The ruins appeared suddenly through the trees, crouching in a hillside hollow, like something ashamed. Not a castle at all, just 4 walls of moss-covered stone forming a roofless rectangle maybe 20 feet across. The structure was smaller than he'd imagined, more pathetic than ominous. Graffiti covered every surface in layers so thick the original stone color was barely visible. Empty beer bottles littered the corners. Cigarette butts formed drifts against the walls. This was Portland's dark legend, a teenage drinking spot with delusions of grandeur. Augustus stepped through the archway, his camera ready, his voice recorder running. The temperature drop hit him like a wall. His breath caught, not from cold, but from the sudden wrongness of it. October in Portland averaged 50 degrees. Inside these walls, he could see frost forming on the stones. He pressed record on his voice memo. 3:47 p.m. Temperature inside the structure approximately 20 degrees colder than outside. No obvious source of... The forest sounds cut off. Birds, wind, distant traffic from Skyline Boulevard, gone. The silence was so complete it felt physical, pressing against his eardrums until they ached. Augustus lowered his phone slowly, his journalistic detachment cracking. That's when he noticed the graffiti was moving. Not all of it, just certain tags, certain words. They slid across the stone surface, like oil on water, rearranging themselves, forming new patterns. Augustus backed toward the entrance, his professional curiosity evaporating into pure animal fear. His shoulder hit something solid where nothing should be. He turned, reaching out, and his hands met resistance. The archway was open. He could see the forest beyond, see the trail, but an invisible barrier sealed him inside. No. His voice came out small. No, this isn't... The graffiti words finished rearranging. They now formed a message in letters 3 feet tall across the western wall. Truth for exit. Augustus hammered against the invisible barrier, threw his shoulder into it, kicked at it with boots that should have connected with open air. Nothing yielded. The silence pressed tighter. His breath came faster, fogging in the impossible cold. A voice spoke, but not from any direction. It came from inside his skull, bypassing his ears entirely, words forming directly in his mind with a pressure that made his teeth ache. You came seeking stories. We will give you one, your own. Who are you? Augustus's voice cracked. What do you want? The graffiti began moving again, faster now, swirling into images. Augustus watched, transfixed with horror, as the paint formed a scene he recognized. A bedroom. His bedroom. 18 months ago. A woman asleep in his bed, her drink on the nightstand showing a residue she hadn't noticed. Him, standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. Stop. The word came out strangled. Stop showing that. The image shifted. Different bedroom, different woman, same drink on the nightstand, same residue, same watching figure. The graffiti cycled through variations, 3, 4, 5 different scenes. All different women, all the same story. Speak your truth, the voice commanded. Say aloud what you've hidden. Only confession opens the way. I don't know what you're talking about. Augustus's hands were shaking. That's not... Those aren't real. You're making things up. The temperature dropped further. Augustus could see ice crystals forming on the walls now, spreading from the corners like living things. The graffiti images became more detailed, zooming in on the drinks, showing pills dissolving, showing timestamps, showing text messages he'd deleted, showing search histories he'd cleared. The evidence he'd been so careful to erase was being reconstructed in spray paint and shadow on ancient stones. 7 women, the voice said, and now it sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. Young and old, male and female, all carrying the same cold certainty. 7 times you drugged someone's drink. 7 times you violated trust. 7 times you convinced them afterward that they'd simply drunk too much, that their memory gaps were their own fault. Speak this truth. Augustus sank to his knees. The professional mask he'd worn for 38 years was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. You don't understand. I never hurt anyone. They were fine afterward. They never even knew. Because you made sure they wouldn't know, the voices replied. Because you chose victims carefully. Because you studied how to avoid consequences. Speak your truth, Augustus Chen. Say what you are. The use of his full name shattered something inside him. This wasn't some random haunting responding to an intruder. Whatever lived in these stones knew him, had been waiting specifically for him, had perhaps pulled him here for this exact moment. The graffiti shifted again, and now it showed something new. Not his crimes, but their aftermath. It showed a woman named Heidi crying in her car, convinced she was losing her mind because she couldn't remember 3 hours of her life. showed another woman, Araya, changing her entire major because she was too afraid to attend the same classes where she'd last had a clear memory. Showed a third woman, Julieta, in a therapist's office, being told her blackouts were probably just anxiety. They blamed themselves, the voices whispered. Each one thought the fault was theirs. You let them believe that. You encourage them to believe that. You are not a writer researching darkness, Augustus. You are the darkness we document. Augustus pressed his forehead against the frozen ground, ice burning his skin. Professional objectivity, the armor he'd used to distance himself from his own actions, was gone. He saw himself clearly for the first time, not as he'd pretended to be, but as he actually was. I drugged them. His voice was barely audible, muffled against stone and earth. I put rohypnol in their drinks when they weren't looking. I waited for them to become confused, compliant. I took advantage of them while they were incapacitated. And afterward, I gaslit them into thinking it was their fault, their responsibility, their shameful secret. I did it 7 times over 3 years. I chose victims who wouldn't be believed if they did suspect something. I was careful. I was methodical. I was a predator. The confession hung in the frozen air. Augustus waited for the barrier to dissolve, for the voices to release him now that he'd spoken their demanded truth. But the silence only deepened. The cold intensified. The graffiti images didn't shatter. They multiplied. You confessed, the voices said. But you confessed with expectation of reward. You spoke truth as a transaction, not as repentance. The witch's castle does not trade with the unrepentant. What do you want from me? Augustus screamed. I said what I did. I admitted it. Admission is not atonement, the voices replied. You seek only escape, not redemption. You would leave here and continue as before, more careful perhaps, but unchanged. The stones remembered Danford Balch, who murdered for pride and showed no remorse until the rope was around his neck. The stones learned from him what to do with men like you. The graffiti began peeling off the walls, not falling but lifting free, transforming from paint into shadow, from shadow into something with substance and intention. The dark shapes moved across the stone surfaces like oil spreading on water, converging from all 4 walls toward the center where Augustus knelt. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The shadows reached him, touched his skin, and where they made contact, he felt nothing. No cold, no warmth, no sensation at all. Numbness spread from the touch points, crawling up his arms, across his chest, into his throat. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. The shadows were inside him now, filling the spaces where sound lived, where breath lived, where the person he'd pretended to be lived. Augustus felt himself being pulled downward, not through the ground, but into it, as if the earth itself was swallowing him inch by inch. He could still see the ruins around him, could still see the gray October sky through the missing roof, but he was sinking into stone that had somehow become permeable. His vision dimmed, not because his eyes were closing, but because something was wrapping around his consciousness, layer after layer, like bandages over a wound that would never heal. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him completely was new graffiti appearing on the walls. 7 names: Heidi, Aria, Julieta, Thea, Aisha, Sylvie, Elaine. His victims, immortalized in spray paint that dripped like blood before the letters solidified into permanent stains on ancient stone. Then Augustus Chen was gone. Not dead, but not alive, in any way that mattered. Somewhere between the stones, somewhere in the cold hollow spaces where the witch's castle kept its collection of the unrepentant, he remained. Conscious, aware, trapped forever in a confession he'd spoken too late and meant too little. The search and rescue team found Augustus's car in the Forest Park parking lot 3 days later. Keys in the ignition, phone on the dashboard, its voice recorder still running. They played back the audio. For 47 minutes they heard Augustus walking the trail, describing what he saw, professional and detached. Then sudden silence, broken by 3 words. "This isn't happening." After that, nothing but static for 6 hours until the battery died. They searched for 2 weeks, scoured every trail, every hollow, every hillside. They found no trace of Augustus Chen. The witch's castle was empty except for graffiti and beer bottles and scattered cigarette butts. But one search and rescue volunteer, a woman named Finley who'd been hiking Forest Park for 20 years, noticed something new on the western wall. 7 names she didn't recognize, written in letters that looked fresh despite the rain that had fallen steadily for 3 days. When she photographed them for the police report, the names didn't appear in the image, just blank stone. Augustus's editor eventually published his research on Pacific Northwest hauntings, crediting him posthumously. The Witch's Castle chapter was included based on his notes, but it felt incomplete. The editor added a footnote about Augustus's disappearance, how he'd been last seen heading to the location he'd researched so thoroughly. She framed it as tragic irony, a writer investigating darkness who got lost in it. She didn't know how right she was. The darkness hadn't just taken Augustus Chen, it had kept him. And in the hollow spaces between stones that have witnessed murder and absorbed guilt for over 160 years, Augustus remains, not as a ghost, because ghosts were once human. He's something less now, an echo of confession without remorse, a warning that the witch's castle doesn't distinguish between past sins and present ones. It simply collects them all, and when the next person arrives seeking stories, seeking thrills, seeking anything in those ruins except honest reckoning with their own darkness, the stones will be ready. They're always ready. They've been practicing since 1859. Imagine being lost in underground tunnels where Shanghai sailors from 1880 may still be trying to escape, and something invisible is herding you deeper into the darkness. That nightmare became reality for Khalil when he lagged behind on a Portland tour he thought would be harmless fun. Khalil had lived in Portland for 6 months and still hadn't done any of the tourist stuff. His coworkers had been bugging him about it, saying he couldn't really understand the city without knowing its darker history. So on a gray Thursday afternoon, he found himself standing outside a nondescript building in Old Town, waiting for the 4 p.m. Shanghai tunnel tour to start. The guide was a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, who wore period clothing and spoke in a theatrical whisper that Khalil found both charming and slightly ridiculous. She gathered the group of 12 tourists around her, explaining how Portland's underground tunnel system had been used in the late 1800s to kidnap drunk men from bars, drag them through the tunnels, and sell them to ship captains who needed crew members. They called it being Shanghaied. "Most people think it's just an urban legend," Dorothy said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But these tunnels are very real, and some say the men who were taken never really left." The group descended a narrow staircase into the tunnels. The temperature dropped immediately, and the smell of damp earth and old stone filled Khalil's nostrils. The tunnels were narrow, maybe 6 feet wide, with brick walls that glistened with moisture. Dorothy led them through a series of connected passages, pointing out holding cells where Shanghaied men had been kept, trapdoors that led up to saloons, iron rings embedded in walls where victims had been chained. Khalil hung back from the group, taking photos with his phone. The lighting was dim, just a few modern LED strips running along the floor, but his camera picked up details the eye couldn't quite catch. Shadows that seemed to move between the bricks, patches of darkness that looked almost solid. He was trying to get a good shot of one of the holding cells when he realized the group's voices had faded. He turned back the way they'd come and walked quickly down the tunnel. It should have been a straight path back to where he'd heard Dorothy's voice. But after 30 seconds of walking, he found himself at a junction he didn't remember passing. 3 tunnels branched off in different directions, all of them identical. Brick walls, damp floor, LED strips providing minimal light. "Hello?" Khalil called out. His voice echoed strangely, bouncing back at him from multiple directions, distorted, as if the tunnels themselves were mocking him. "Dorothy? Anyone?" Silence. Not even the muffled sound of footsteps or distant conversation. Khalil chose the middle tunnel and walked faster now, his heart rate climbing. The tunnel curved gently to the left, then opened into a larger chamber. The walls here were different, older brick, no LED strips, just his phone's flashlight cutting through blackness that seemed to swallow the beam after a few feet. Scratches covered the walls, hundreds of them. Tally marks carved into the brick, grouped in sets of 5. Khalil approached slowly, running his finger over the marks. They were deep, made by something metal, made by someone who'd been counting. He found numbers scratched beside them. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. They went up to Day 847. "What the hell?" Khalil whispered. Someone had been down here for 847 days. That was over 2 years. That couldn't be right. This was a tourist attraction. People came through here every day. Someone would have noticed if... A sound cut through his thoughts. Not footsteps. Something worse. Breathing. Ragged, wet breathing like lungs struggling to pull air through water-damaged tissue. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the chamber in a way that made his skin crawl. Then voices joined it. Whispers in a dozen different tones, all speaking at once, words overlapping, until they became an incomprehensible susurrus that filled the space like static. Khalil spun in a circle, his flashlight beam cutting through empty air. There was no one, just him and the breathing and the whispers and the terrible certainty that he was very much not alone. Then the whispers resolved into words, not English. Something older, rougher, profanity and dialects dead for a century. Prayers in languages he didn't recognize, pleading in voices that had forgotten how to form coherent sentences. The cacophony rose until Khalil pressed his hands over his ears, but the sounds came from inside his head now, bypassing his hearing entirely. "Stop!" he screamed. "Stop it!" The voices cut off instantly. The silence that followed was worse. Khalil's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone. He needed to get out. Now. He ran back the way he'd come, but the tunnel opened into a different chamber. Not the one he'd just left, but something else. Something he definitely hadn't passed before. This chamber had objects scattered across the floor. Old objects. Shoes. Dozens of pairs. All of them ancient. Leather cracked and rotted. Work boots from another century. Among the shoes were other things. Belt buckles, buttons, fragments of cloth, the remnants of clothing that had long since decayed, and bones. Not many. Just a few scattered pieces, but Khalil knew what they were. His stomach lurched. This wasn't part of the tour. This was something real. Something that had been hidden down here for decades, maybe longer. These were the men who never came back. The ones who'd been shanghaied and never made it to a ship because they died down here first, in the dark, counting days that blurred together until they forgot their own names. Khalil backed away from the pile and his foot kicked something. A metal object that rang against the stone floor. He pointed his light at it, a flask, old and tarnished, with initials engraved on the side, TM, 1883. The year stared at him. 1883. This flask had been down here for 142 years. The breathing started again, but this time it was accompanied by movement. Not footsteps, something dragging. Heavy objects being pulled across stone, metal scraping, the rattle of chains. Khalil's light found the source, and he nearly dropped his phone. The chains hanging from the wall rings were moving on their own, swinging back and forth with increasing violence, as if invisible hands were yanking on them in rage or desperation. "I'm sorry," Khalil heard himself saying, though he didn't know why he was apologizing or to whom. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I just want to leave. Please let me leave." The chains stopped moving. For 3 seconds, everything was still. Then they all jerked forward at once, straining against their wall mounts, reaching toward him like grasping fingers. Khalil ran. The tunnels became a maze. He took turn after turn, junction after junction, each passage looking identical to the last. His phone's GPS showed nothing. No map, no location, just a spinning icon that couldn't figure out where he was. The battery was draining faster than it should, dropping from 91% to 73% in what felt like minutes. The flashlight flickered occasionally, threatening to die and leave him in absolute darkness. He passed more scratched walls. Day 1. Day 1. Day 1. The same number, repeated over and over in different handwriting, as if multiple people had started counting and given up, or started over, or forgotten they'd already counted that day. The repetition was more disturbing than the high numbers. It suggested confusion, madness, minds breaking under the weight of endless darkness. A sound began echoing through the tunnels, singing, men's voices raised in chorus, slurred and rough, singing sea shanties in old dialects that predated modern English. Roll me over, in the clover, roll me over, lay me down, and do it again. The melody was recognizable but wrong, distorted, as if the singers had forgotten how the song really went and were approximating from memory, degraded by decades underground. Khalil followed the singing because it was the only thing that seemed directional, the only anchor in the disorienting labyrinth. It led him to a final chamber, enormous compared to the others, its ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls were lined with iron rings, and hanging from some of them were chains that ended in manacles. Rust, or something darker, stained the metal. In the center of the room was a trapdoor set into the floor, and from beneath it came the sound of water, flowing water. The Willamette River, maybe, or some underground stream. On the wall above the trapdoor, words had been carved into the brick in letters a foot tall. The Shanghai. Never stops it, always needs more. It takes and takes and takes you. We're brought here on purpose. Khalil stared at the last line. On purpose. He'd thought he'd gotten separated by accident, that he'd simply wandered too far. But what if he hadn't? What if he'd been selected, herded, guided here by something that needed what? Another victim, another soul to add to its collection, movement in the corner of his vision. Khalil spun, his light catching glimpses of translucent figures forming from condensation and shadow. They weren't fully visible, just suggestions of human shapes, outlines that solidified for a moment before dissolving. But there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, filling the chamber, all facing him, all utterly silent now. One of them stepped forward, or seemed to. The movement was more like a shifting of air than actual walking. It reached out with a hand that was barely there, fingers like smoke, and pointed at the trapdoor. The gesture was clear. Go through. Join us. Become what we became. No, Khalil said, backing away. No, I'm not. I'm leaving. I'm finding a way out. But there was no way out. He'd tried every tunnel, every passage, every turn. They all led back here, to this chamber, to this trapdoor, to this choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The tunnel system wanted him. Had wanted him from the moment he'd descended those stairs. Maybe earlier. Maybe it had been calling to him for months, ever since he'd moved to Portland, waiting for him to finally answer. The figures began moving closer, not threatening, just inevitable, like a tide coming in. Khalil felt cold spread through his chest, not from temperature, but from something else, something fundamental changing inside him. The air grew thick, harder to breathe, as if the oxygen was being replaced by something that had been underground so long it had forgotten what life felt like. His vision blurred. The translucent figures were overlapping with his sight now, superimposing themselves over reality. He could see through their forms to the men they'd been. Sailors with calloused hands, drifters with hollow eyes, immigrants who'd come seeking opportunity and found only darkness, all of them wearing the same expression. Not anger or malice, just exhausted acceptance. Khalil's knees hit the stone floor. He didn't remember falling. His phone slipped from his hand and skittered across the ground, its light spinning wildly before settling on the trapdoor. In that moment of illumination, he saw what was carved underneath the larger message. Hundreds of names, scratched tiny and desperate into every available inch of brick. The names of everyone who'd come down here and never left. A roster of the forgotten. The last thing Khalil heard before consciousness left him was the singing starting again, closer now, as if the voices were inside his throat. The last thing he felt was hands, cold and not quite solid, lifting him, carrying him toward the trapdoor that was opening on its own, revealing black water below. The last thing he thought was that he should have listened to the stories, should have stayed with the group, should have known that some places in Portland's underground don't let go once they have you. They found Khalil's body on the Willamette River bank at dawn. A jogger called 911. The paramedics said he was hypothermic but alive, unconscious, his lungs full of water that chemical analysis later showed matched 19th century harbor composition. Impossible, but documented. His phone was ruined, his clothes soaked, his memories of the incident completely gone. The tour company insisted he'd never been on their roster. Dorothy didn't recognize him. Security footage showed no one matching his description entering the building. But the hospital found something in his wallet that hadn't been there before. An old metal tag, the kind used to identify sailors on merchant ships, stamped with initials, KH, and a date, October 17th, 2025, yesterday's date. Except the tag was tarnished, corroded, aged like something that had been underground for a century. Khalil moved out of Portland within a month. He never spoke about what happened in those hours he can't remember. But sometimes he wakes up tasting river water and hearing songs he doesn't know the words to, sung in voices that have been dead for 140 years. And sometimes, when he's alone in the dark, he swears he can hear chains rattling, dragging, reaching for him from tunnels that exist beneath every city, in every place where terrible things happen so often that the earth itself learned to hunger. The Shanghai tunnels are still there, still offering tours, still taking groups down into the dark to hear stories about the men who were stolen and sold and forgotten. And sometimes, very rarely, someone lags behind, gets separated, disappears for a few hours before turning up confused and waterlogged with no memory of how they got to the river. The tour guides have learned not to wait too long when someone goes missing. They've learned that the tunnels give some people back, not all, but some. And the ones who return are never quite the same. They carry the underground with them, a piece of that darkness that won't let go, that whispers in dreams about chains and water, and the endless counting of days that blur together into one long, suffocating night. Have you ever woken up in a place that shouldn't exist anymore, where doctors from a century ago somehow know your deepest health fears and are preparing to treat you with procedures that killed their patients? Esme found herself trapped in exactly that nightmare when she checked into the renovated Hot Lake Hotel, not knowing its history as an experimental medical facility. The hotel looked beautiful in the photos. A historic building in Union County, Oregon, surrounded by natural hot springs that supposedly had healing properties. Esme had booked 3 nights as a solo wellness retreat, desperate for a break from her life in Seattle. She was 32, recently divorced, dealing with anxiety that kept her awake most nights, and her therapist had suggested she try something restorative. Hot springs sounded perfect. A century-old hotel with a spa and thermal pools, exactly what she needed. What the website hadn't mentioned, or what Esme had missed while booking, was that the Hot Lake Hotel had been a sanatorium. Not just a hospital, but an experimental medical facility that had operated from 1864 to 1934, treating everything from tuberculosis to mental illness with techniques that were considered cutting edge at the time and horrifying in retrospect. Hydrotherapy, surgical experimentation, isolation treatments. The building had seen thousands of patients over its 70-year medical operation. Not all of them had left alive. Esme arrived on a Thursday evening in late October. The hotel was beautiful, restored to its original 1907 grandeur, with period furniture and fixtures that gave it an authentic early 20th century feel. The front desk clerk, a cheerful woman named McKenna, checked her in and handed her an old-fashioned brass key. "You're in room 214, McKenna said. "Second floor, east wing. That's one of our premium rooms with direct access to the mineral bath. You'll love it." "What was this building originally?" Esme asked, noticing medical equipment displayed in glass cases around the lobby. Old surgical tools, glass syringes, leather restraints. "Oh, it was a sanatorium for decades," McKenna said brightly. "Dr. William Oram ran it. He was a pioneer in hydrotherapy and surgical techniques. Some of his methods were controversial, but he helped a lot of people. The hotel celebrates that history. We even offer historically inspired spa treatments based on the original therapies, though modernized, of course." Esme felt a slight unease but pushed it aside. It was just history. The building had been fully renovated. It was a luxury hotel now, not a medical facility. She took the key and climbed the wide staircase to the second floor. Room 214 was spacious and elegant. A four-poster bed dominated the center, dressed in white linens that looked crisp and expensive. Period furniture filled the corners: a writing desk, an armchair, a wardrobe. French doors led to a private balcony overlooking the grounds, and in the bathroom, a large clawfoot tub that McKenna had mentioned was fed directly by the natural hot springs. Esme unpacked her bag, changed into comfortable clothes, and decided to try the mineral bath before dinner. She ran the water, watching it fill the tub with a slight mineral smell, sulfur, and something metallic. The temperature was perfect, almost too hot, but not quite. She slipped into the water and felt her muscles immediately relax. The heat penetrated deep, easing tension she'd been carrying for months. She closed her eyes and let herself drift, the water lapping gently around her shoulders. This was exactly what she needed. A few days of quiet, of rest, of not thinking about her failed marriage or her anxiety or the insomnia that had been getting worse. Just heat and silence and... A sound jolted her awake. Esme's eyes snapped open. She must have dozed off because the water had cooled significantly. But that wasn't what had woken her. It was a voice. A man's voice, coming from somewhere nearby, speaking in a measured clinical tone. Patient presence with chronic anxiety, insomnia, and intrusive thoughts. Recommended treatment: hydrotherapy combined with isolation to reduce external stimuli. If symptoms persist, we'll proceed to more invasive interventions. Esme sat up in the tub, water sloshing. "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. She waited, heart pounding, but heard nothing more. It must have come from another room. Sound probably traveled through the old building's walls. She climbed out of the tub, dried off quickly, and changed into her pajamas. It was nearly 10 p.m. She'd been in the bath longer than she'd realized. Too tired to go down for dinner, Esme ordered room service and ate in bed while scrolling through her phone. The hotel Wi-Fi was weak, pages loading slowly, but she managed to pull up some information about Hot Lake's history. What she read made her stomach turn. Dr. William Oram had indeed been a pioneer, but many of his techniques had been experimental and dangerous. Hydrotherapy treatments, where patients were kept in scalding or ice-cold water for hours. Surgical procedures performed without proper anesthesia. Isolation treatments, where mentally ill patients were locked in rooms for weeks. The sanatorium had been shut down in 1934 after multiple patient deaths and allegations of medical malpractice. The building had sat abandoned for decades before being converted into a hotel. Esme set her phone down, feeling uneasy. She should have researched this place before booking, but it was just one night. She'd check out tomorrow if she felt too uncomfortable. She turned off the lights and tried to sleep. She woke to the sensation of cold water on her skin. Esme's eyes opened in darkness, and for a disorienting moment, she couldn't understand what she was feeling. Her nightgown was soaked. The sheets beneath her were wet and cold. Had she spilled something? She reached for the bedside lamp and froze. She wasn't in the bed anymore. She was in the bathtub, lying in ice-cold water, still wearing her nightgown. The bathroom lights were on, harsh and bright, and standing beside the tub was a man in a white coat. He held a clipboard and was writing notes, his pen scratching against paper with deliberate precision. "What? Who are you? How did I—" Esme tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't respond properly. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if drugged. The man looked up. He was in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and wire-rimmed glasses. His expression was clinical, detached. Patient is experiencing confusion, likely due to the sedative. This is expected. We'll proceed with the cold water immersion for another 20 minutes, then move to the examination. "I'm not a patient." Esme's voice came out slurred. "I'm a guest. This is a hotel. You can't do this." The man made another note on his clipboard. "Denial and agitation. Common symptoms. The treatment will help, Miss Esme. Your anxiety has gone untreated for too long. We've identified several concerning patterns in your sleep and thought processes. The hydrotherapy will help regulate your nervous system." Terror cut through the drug-induced fog. "How do you know my name? How do you know about my anxiety?" He smiled, a cold, professional expression. "We know everything about our patients. That's what makes our treatments so effective. We tailor the approach to each individual's specific pathology." He consulted his clipboard. "Your insomnia stems from unresolved trauma related to your divorce. Your anxiety manifests primarily at night, when you're alone with your thoughts. You've been having intrusive thoughts about death, about your own mortality, about diseases you might contract. Quite serious, really. Left untreated, this could develop into something much worse." Esme felt tears streaming down her face. Everything he was saying was true. Things she'd barely admitted to her therapist. Things she'd never told anyone in full detail. "How do you know these things?" "The sanatorium knows," he said simply. "It's been collecting information about suffering for over 70 years. Every patient who walked through these doors, every fear they carried, every secret illness. The building absorbed it all, and now it uses that knowledge to help, to heal, to treat." "This isn't healing." Esme managed to move her arm, tried to grab the edge of the tub to pull herself out. "You're not even real. The sanatorium closed in 1934. You're a ghost or a hallucination or—" The doctor's expression didn't change. "The sanatorium never truly closed, Miss Esme. It simply changed forms. This building is still a treatment facility. It's still trying to cure people. And you came here seeking healing, did you not? Your website search history shows you've been researching wellness retreats for months. You chose Hot Lake specifically because you wanted to address your health concerns." "Not like this," Esme whispered. "Not with whatever this is." The doctor checked his pocket watch. 20 minutes complete. Time for the examination. He set down his clipboard and reached for her arm. Esme screamed. The sound echoed off the bathroom tiles, but no one came. No hotel staff burst through the door. No concerned guests knocked to check on her. She was alone with this apparition that knew too much, that had somehow pulled her from her bed into ice water, that was touching her with hands that felt solid and cold and terrifyingly real. He pulled her from the tub effortlessly, her body still not responding to her commands. He dried her off with rough efficiency and helped her into a hospital gown that appeared from nowhere. Then he guided her back into the bedroom, where the furniture had changed. The four-poster bed was now a metal-framed hospital bed. The writing desk had become a medical examination table. The wardrobe had transformed into a glass cabinet, filled with surgical instruments that gleamed under lights that were now harsh and fluorescent rather than warm and vintage. "Please," Esme begged. as he lifted her onto the examination table. "Please don't do this. I'll leave. I'll check out right now. Just let me go." "You can't leave mid-treatment," the doctor said, securing leather restraints around her wrists and ankles. "That would be medically irresponsible. Your condition requires immediate intervention. We've identified a concerning irregularity in your cardiovascular system. Nothing you're aware of yet, but the sanatorium detected it. A weakness in your heart valve that could fail at any moment. We need to address it before it becomes fatal." "There's nothing wrong with my heart." But even as Esme said it, doubt crept in. She'd been feeling strange lately. Occasional chest tightness, moments where her heartbeat felt irregular. She'd assumed it was anxiety. What if it wasn't? What if there really was something wrong with her heart, and this place, this building, that had treated thousands of patients, had somehow sensed it? The doctor wheeled over a tray of instruments, scalpels, clamps, needles, saws. "We'll perform a minor exploratory procedure. Nothing too invasive, just a small incision to examine the valve directly. Our success rate with this procedure is quite high, nearly 40% survival." 40%. Esme's voice rose to a shriek. "That means 60% die." "Medicine requires sacrifice," the doctor said calmly, selecting a scalpel. Dr. Oram always said that. "Progress demands that we take risks. Some patients don't survive, but their deaths contribute to our understanding. Their sacrifice helps us refine the techniques for future patients. You should be honored to be part of that legacy." He leaned over her, scalpel catching the harsh light, and Esme realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't a hallucination or a nightmare. This was real, or as real as anything could be when past and present had somehow collapsed into each other, when a building's history had become so saturated with medical horror that it continued performing treatments on anyone who entered seeking wellness. The scalpel descended toward her chest. Esme screamed again and thrashed against the restraints with every ounce of strength she had. The leather cut into her wrists, but she didn't care. She twisted, kicked, fought with animal desperation. The table shook. The instruments rattled on their tray. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. The harsh lights flickered and became warm vintage bulbs. The examination table became a writing desk that she was leaning against, her hands gripping its edge so hard her knuckles were white. The doctor vanished. The surgical instruments disappeared. The room was just a hotel room again. Beautiful, elegant, furnished with period pieces and soft lighting. Esme collapsed to the floor, gasping. She was wearing her pajamas, not a hospital gown. Her wrist showed no restraint marks. The bathroom was normal, clawfoot tub, no medical equipment. She crawled to the door, unlocked it, and stumbled into the hallway. The hotel was quiet, peaceful. Esme ran down the stairs, nearly falling in her haste, and burst into the lobby. McKenna was still at the front desk, looking up in surprise. "Miss Esme, are you all right? It's 3 a.m. Do you need—" "I'm checking out," Esme said, her voice shaking. "Right now. I need to leave right now." McKenna's expression shifted slightly. Something knowing entered her eyes. "Did you have an episode in your room?" "An episode? Is that what you call it? There was a doctor, and he knew things about me, and he tried to—" Esme couldn't finish the sentence. "The sanatorium," McKenna said softly. "It still treats guests sometimes, especially those who come here with genuine health concerns. It means well. Dr. Oram's spirit is still trying to heal people." "He tried to cut me open," Esme screamed. "That's not healing." "His methods were ahead of their time," McKenna said, and her voice had taken on a strange, distant quality. "Not everyone survived, but those who did were cured of their ailments. The sanatorium only wants to help. It detected something wrong with you, something you've been ignoring. Maybe you should let it complete the treatment." Esme backed toward the door. "You're insane. This whole place is insane. I'm leaving." "You can leave," McKenna said. "But the sanatorium will remember you. It knows about your heart now. It knows about the weakness you've been ignoring. And when that valve fails, and it will fail, Miss Esme, probably within the year, if left untreated, you'll wish you'd let Dr. Oram fix it. His methods may be unorthodox, but they work. Esme ran. She got in her car and drove through the night, not stopping until she was back in Seattle. She went to her regular doctor the next day and demanded a full cardiac workup. The tests showed nothing. Her heart was perfectly healthy. No valve weakness, no irregularities, nothing wrong at all. But 3 months later, she started feeling the chest tightness more frequently, started noticing her heartbeat skipping occasionally. Her doctor ordered more tests. Everything came back normal. It's just anxiety, they told her. Stress manifesting as physical symptoms. Very common. Esme wanted to believe them, but sometimes late at night she felt cold water on her skin even though she was dry. Sometimes she heard the scratch of a pen on a clipboard, faint and distant. Sometimes she smelled the sulfur of the hot springs mixed with the metallic scent of surgical instruments. And once, when she looked in her bathroom mirror, she saw marks on her chest. Faint surgical scars, where no incisions had ever been made, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a medical diagram, mapping out the exact location of her heart valve. The scars faded within seconds, but they'd been there. She'd seen them. The Hot Lake Sanatorium is still open, still taking guests who come seeking healing, seeking rest, seeking relief from ailments both physical and mental. And deep in its walls, in the spaces between the renovated rooms and modern amenities, Dr. William Oram still practices medicine, still treats patients with the same experimental zeal he brought to his work in 1907, still achieves his 40% success rate, which he considers quite respectable given the complexity of the procedures. The building remembers everyone who enters. It catalogs their illnesses, their fears, their undiagnosed conditions. And some guests, the ones who come with real suffering, the ones who genuinely need help, those guests get the full sanatorium experience. Past and present merge. Treatment begins. And by morning, they either wake up in a normal hotel room, terrified but unharmed, or they don't wake up at all. The hotel staff has learned not to ask too many questions about guests who check out at 3 a.m. looking traumatized. They've learned to smile and nod when people report strange experiences. And they've learned to keep careful records of who survives their stay and who doesn't, because Dr. Oram appreciates documentation. He always did. Even 100 years later, he's still collecting data, still refining his techniques, still pursuing the perfect cure. And Esme, back in Seattle, trying to ignore the occasional irregular heartbeat, trying to convince herself that her chest pains are just anxiety, sometimes wonders if she should have stayed, if she should have let the treatment finish, because the sanatorium was right about one thing. It did detect something her modern doctors missed. And whatever is wrong with her heart, it's getting worse. But she'll never go back to Hot Lake, never submit to Dr. Oram's scalpel. She'll take her chances. With modern medicine, even if the ghost of the sanatorium whispers in her dreams that it's too late, that she had her chance for a cure, that when her heart finally fails, she'll die knowing she could have been saved by a 40% survival rate and a doctor who never stopped caring for his patients, even after death, even after a century, even when caring looks exactly like torture and healing requires survival rates that would horrify any modern medical board. The sanatorium still stands, still treats, still tries to cure the suffering of anyone desperate enough to walk through its doors, seeking wellness they can't find anywhere else. There's a church in the ghost town of Golden, Oregon, where you can see a congregation through your camera lens that vanishes when you lower it. And they get closer every time you look. That's what photographer Itzel discovered when she became obsessed with seeing their faces. Itzel was a professional photographer who specialized in abandoned places, ghost towns, forgotten buildings, industrial ruins, She'd made a career capturing the beauty in decay. Her Instagram had 200,000 followers. Her prints sold in galleries across the Pacific Northwest, and she'd just signed a book deal for a collection called Oregon's Forgotten Spaces. Golden Ghost Town in southern Oregon was supposed to be her final shoot before the manuscript deadline. She arrived at dawn when the light was perfect. Golden had been a mining town in the 1890s, thriving during the gold rush before the mines played out and everyone left. Now it was just a handful of weathered buildings scattered across a hillside, a general store with caved-in roof, a schoolhouse with broken windows, and the church. The church was what she'd come for. Built in 1896, it was the only structure still relatively intact, with white paint peeling like old skin and a steeple that leaned slightly to the left. Itzel set up her equipment outside, photographing the church from different angles as the sunrise painted it gold and pink. Beautiful shots, exactly what she needed. But something felt off. Through her viewfinder, she kept seeing movement in the windows, shadows that shifted when nothing should be casting them. She lowered her camera and looked with her naked eye. Nothing. Just empty windows and darkness inside. Professional curiosity overrode unease. She approached the church, pushed open the door that hung crooked on rusted hinges, and stepped inside. The interior was what she'd expected. Dusty pews, broken floorboards, a pulpit covered in bird droppings. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. She raised her camera and looked through the viewfinder to frame a shot of the altar. Her breath caught. Through the lens, the church was full. People sat in every pew, their backs to her, wearing clothing from the 1890s. Women in high-necked dresses and elaborate hats. Men in dark suits, children in their Sunday best. They sat perfectly still, facing forward toward where a preacher would stand. Itzel's hands trembled. She lowered the camera and looked with her eyes. The church was empty. Just her, in the dust and the broken pews. She raised the camera again. The congregation was still there, visible only through the viewfinder. They hadn't moved, hadn't turned around, just sat in absolute stillness, listening to a sermon she couldn't hear. Itzel took the shot. The shutter clicked. She lowered the camera to check the image on the screen. The photo showed an empty church. No people, no congregation, just dust and decay. Exactly what her naked eye saw. But through the viewfinder, they were still there. Itzel's heart was racing now. This wasn't a trick of light or a camera malfunction. She was a professional. She knew her equipment, knew optics, knew photography inside and out. What she was seeing through the lens shouldn't be possible. She raised the camera again, zooming in this time, trying to see faces to understand what she was looking at. The congregation was closer. Not by much, maybe one pew forward, but definitely closer than before. They still faced away from her, still sat in perfect silence, but they'd moved. Itzel felt ice spread through her chest. She lowered the camera, looked with her eyes. Empty church. Raised the camera, full of people, one pew closer. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to leave. But she was a photographer. Documenting the inexplicable was literally her job, and this was something no one else had captured. This was proof of something beyond normal reality. If she could photograph it, really photograph it in a way that showed up in the final image, it would be the most important work of her career. Itzel adjusted her settings, trying different exposures, different focal lengths, different filters. Each time she raised the camera, the congregation was there. Each time she lowered it, they vanished. And each time she looked again, they were one pew closer. Now she could make out more details through the viewfinder, the texture of their clothing, the way dust particles seemed to pass through them rather than settling on them, the absolute stillness of their posture. They were 5 pews from the back now, 5 pews from where she stood. Itzel knew she should stop looking, should walk away, should leave this place and never come back. but she needed to see their faces, needed to understand what they were, why they existed only through her camera lens, why they moved closer each time she observed them. She raised the camera. 4 pews away now. She could see individual hats, individual hairstyles, the small details that made them distinct people rather than a collective mass. But still, they faced forward. Still, she couldn't see their faces. Itzel's finger hovered over the shutter button. Should she take a photo? Would that make them move faster? She lowered the camera without shooting. When she raised it again, they were 3 pews away. Close enough that she could see the fabric of their clothes had a strange quality. Not quite solid, not quite transparent, but something in between. Like they were projected into the space rather than occupying it physically. One of the children, a girl maybe 8 years old in a white dress, had her hand raised as if asking a question. The hand had been down before. They were becoming more animated. Itzel backed toward the door, but she couldn't stop looking through the viewfinder. It was compulsive now, addictive. She needed to see what happened next, needed to see their faces, needed to understand. 2 pews away. She could hear something now. Not with her ears, but the way the air pressure changed, the way silence can be so complete it becomes its own kind of sound. They were singing. She couldn't hear the hymn, but she could feel it, could sense the vibration of voices raised in worship. 1 pew away. Itzel's back hit the doorframe. She was at the threshold now, half in the church and half out, but she couldn't lower the camera. Through the viewfinder, the congregation filled every pew, including the one directly in front of her. The closest figure was a man in a black suit, his hat sitting perfectly level on his head. If she reached out, she could touch where he sat, except he wasn't there when she looked with her eyes. When she lowered the camera to check, they began to turn around. Not all at once, but starting from the front pews and rippling backward like a wave. Slowly, deliberately, they turned to face her. Itzel watched through the viewfinder, paralyzed by curiosity and terror, as the congregation revealed themselves. The people in the front pews had no eyes. Where their eyes should be were just smooth patches of skin, as if they'd been born without sockets. But they were looking at her somehow, their eyeless faces turned in her direction with focused attention. The second row turned. These had eyes, but they were wrong. All pupil, no iris, just black circles that reflected nothing. The third row turned. Their eyes were empty sockets, dark holes that went back farther than a skull should allow. Each row had different eyes, different wrongness, as if the congregation couldn't remember what eyes were supposed to look like and were trying different versions. Itzel wanted to lower the camera, wanted to run, but her hands wouldn't obey. The back rows were turning now, getting closer to where she stood. The girl in the white dress turned, and her eyes were normal, perfectly normal, brown and bright and alive. But her mouth opened far too wide, impossibly wide, and Itzel realized she was still singing the hymn that had no sound. The final row turned. The man in the black suit directly in front of her turned. His eyes met hers through the camera lens, and they were her eyes. Exactly her eyes. Same color, same shape, looking at her with an expression she recognized from every self-portrait she'd ever taken. He smiled with her smile. Then he spoke, and she heard it not through her ears, but through the camera, as if the words traveled through light and glass directly into her mind. "You kept looking," he said with her voice. "You couldn't stop. None of them can. That's how we grow." The congregation stood as one. They began moving toward her, walking through the pews rather than around them, their bodies passing through wood like it wasn't there. But they were becoming more solid with each step, gaining substance, gaining presence, as if her observation was feeding them, making them real. Itzel finally found the will to lower her camera. The church was empty. She was alone. She stumbled backward out the door, into the sunlight, gasping for air. Her camera felt heavy in her hands, heavier than it should be. She looked at the screen to check the photos she'd taken. The first shots from outside were normal. The shots from inside showed the empty church. Except for one detail she hadn't noticed while shooting. In the corner of each frame, barely visible, was a figure. A different person in each photo. And in each successive photo, they were standing closer to where the camera had been. The last photo she'd taken, the one right before they'd all turned around, showed the church from her perspective. And in the very edge of the frame, so close it was almost out of focus, was a hand reaching toward the lens. A hand that looked exactly like hers, down to the scar on the thumb she'd gotten from a broken tripod 3 years ago. Itzel ran to her car. She threw her equipment in the back seat and drove away from Golden faster than the dirt roads could safely handle. She didn't look back. She didn't take any more photos. She drove straight to the nearest town and checked into a motel, where she sat on the bed shaking for 3 hours before she could think clearly enough to make a plan. She should delete the photos, should destroy the memory card, should forget this ever happened. But she was a photographer. Documentation was her purpose, her identity. And these photos, even though they didn't show what she'd seen through the viewfinder, they still showed something. Something no one else had captured. Something important. Itzel opened her laptop and uploaded the photos. She spent hours in editing software, adjusting exposure, increasing contrast, zooming in on details. And there, in the shadows of the empty church, when she pushed the brightness far beyond normal parameters, she could see them. Faint, almost invisible, but there. The outlines of people sitting in pews. The suggestion of faces turning toward the camera. And in the very last image, clear enough that no one could dismiss it as pareidolia or artifact. A full figure standing right where she'd been standing, holding a camera identical to hers, pointing it toward the door, as if photographing someone leaving. She posted the images to her Instagram that night with a caption about Golden Ghost Town, an unusual photographic phenomena. Within hours, the post had thousands of likes. Comments flooded in from other photographers asking about her settings, her equipment, how she'd achieved such an eerie effect. 3 different paranormal investigation groups asked for the location. A dozen photographers said they were planning trips to Golden to capture similar images. Itzel read the comments with growing dread. She wanted to tell them not to go, to stay away, to never look through a camera lens in that church. But how could she explain? They'd think she was crazy. They'd think it was a marketing stunt for her book. And part of her, the photographer part that had made her keep looking even when she should have run, wanted to see what they'd capture. Wanted to see if the congregation would appear for them too. Wanted to know if she was the only one, or if the church would perform for anyone who looked through a lens. 2 weeks later, a photographer named Marcus went to Golden. He posted photos on Instagram. Same church, same empty pews, same faint figures visible only when brightness was pushed to extremes. But his figures were in different pews, closer to the camera than Itzel's had been. And in his final photo, there were 2 figures by the door, both holding cameras, both facing outward. Marcus didn't respond to comments after that post. His account went silent. The local sheriff did a welfare check a week later and found his car parked outside the Golden Church, doors open, camera sitting on the driver's seat with a full memory card. The photos on the card showed the church interior, shot after shot, the figures growing closer in each frame until the final image showed nothing but darkness and what might have been an eye, impossibly large, impossibly close to the lens, staring directly into it. Marcus was never found. The search was called off after 2 weeks. The official assumption was that he'd wandered into the wilderness and gotten lost, maybe fallen into an abandoned mine shaft. The forest around Golden was full of them. Itzel knew better. She'd seen the photos before. The sheriff's office took the camera as evidence. She'd recognized the pattern, the progression, the way the congregation grew with each photographer who came to look. They were feeding on observation, on being seen through lenses, on the attention of people who couldn't resist looking one more time. She hasn't taken a photograph since. Her book deal fell through when she couldn't deliver the final images. Her Instagram followers dwindled when she stopped posting. Her gallery dropped her when she had no new work to show, but Itzel doesn't care. She sold all her cameras, destroyed her memory cards, deleted her archives, because she learned something that day in Golden that she wishes she could forget. Some things don't just become real when you look at them. Some things become real when you can't stop looking. And somewhere in a ghost town church in southern Oregon, a congregation grows larger with each photographer who points a lens in their direction, each person who raises a viewfinder to their eye and thinks, just one more shot. They're patient, they're always there, and they're always getting closer, one frame at a time, waiting for the moment when the distance finally closes, and the person behind the camera becomes part of the congregation themselves, another figure in another photographer's viewfinder, another ghost who exists only when observed, reaching toward the next lens that dares to look. They say if you see your reflection in Opal Creek move differently than you do, you have exactly 3 days before it climbs out of the water to replace you. Kamari didn't believe in superstitions until she watched her reflection smile while her own face remained expressionless. Kamari had come to the Opal Creek wilderness for a solo backpacking trip. 3 days, 2 nights, hiking through old-growth forest that had stood untouched for centuries. She was a software engineer from Portland, 29 years old, desperately needing a break from screens and code and the constant hum of the city. The wilderness was supposed to be healing, restorative, the kind of place where you could clear your mind and reconnect with something real. The trail wound through Douglas firs and western hemlocks so massive they blocked out most of the sky. Ferns carpeted the forest floor. The air smelled of moss and cedar and the particular dampness that only exists in Pacific Northwest forests. Kamari hiked for 6 hours before reaching Opal Creek itself, a pristine waterway that ran crystal clear over smooth stones, reflecting the canopy above in shades of green and gold. She set up camp near the creek, choosing a flat spot beneath an ancient cedar. The sound of running water was soothing, meditative. She filtered water from the creek, cooked a simple dinner on her camp stove, and sat watching the light fade as evening settled over the forest. This was exactly what she'd needed. Peace, quiet. No emails, no meetings, no notifications. Just her and the wilderness. As twilight deepened, Kamari walked to the creek's edge to wash her dishes. She knelt on a smooth boulder and dipped her pot into the clear water. That's when she saw her reflection. The creek was calm here, almost still, creating a perfect mirror on the water's surface. She could see herself clearly, kneeling, holding the pot, her face illuminated by the last rays of sunset filtering through the trees. Except her reflection was smiling. A small smile, subtle, but definitely there. Kamari's face wasn't smiling. She was neutral, tired from the hike, focused on cleaning her dishes. But the face looking back at her from the water was smiling like it knew something she didn't. Kamari froze. She stopped moving, stayed perfectly still, watching her reflection. It stopped too, matching her stillness. But the smile remained. She touched her own face, feeling for any unconscious expression she might not be aware of. Her lips were neutral, not curved upward at all. Yet, in the water, her reflection's mouth was definitely smiling. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. Kamari stood quickly, backing away from the creek. She must have imagined it. A trick of the light, or the way water distorts images, or simple exhaustion playing with her perception. She returned to her tent, crawled into her sleeping bag, and tried to convince herself it had been nothing, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time. She closed her eyes. She saw that smile, small and knowing and wrong. Eventually, she drifted into uneasy rest, filled with dreams of water and reflections and things that watched from beneath smooth surfaces. Morning came with birdsong and filtered sunlight. Kamari woke feeling foolish about her reaction the night before. In daylight, the forest was beautiful and unthreatening. She made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to spend the day exploring rather than hiking out early. She hadn't come all this way to be scared off by her own imagination. The creek beckoned. She walked along its bank, following the clear water upstream through the forest. The wilderness was stunning. Massive trees, vibrant undergrowth, the creek itself flowing over rocks, worn smooth by centuries of current. She took photos with her phone, even though there was no signal, wanting to remember this place. She came to a pool where the creek widened and deepened, water so clear she could see the bottom 12 feet down. Smooth stones lined the pool in shades of gray and green. Small fish darted between them. Kamari sat on a boulder at the pool's edge, dangling her feet in the cold water, feeling tension drain from her shoulders. This was why she'd come. This peace, this beauty, this connection to something larger than herself. She looked down at her reflection in the still pool. It looked back at her. Normal. Smiling slightly. Wait. Kamari's smile dropped. Her reflections didn't. In fact, as she stared, her reflection's smile widened. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. While Kamari's face remained neutral with growing alarm, her reflection grinned. Then it waved. Her reflection raised one hand and waved at her with small, deliberate movements. Kamari's hands were both braced against the boulder, supporting her weight. Neither hand was moving, but in the water, her reflection waved cheerfully, as if greeting an old friend. Kamari scrambled backward, her feet splashing out of the water. She stood on the bank, heart hammering, staring at the pool. Her reflection remained in the water, even though she'd moved back. It shouldn't be there. She was 6 feet from the edge now, too far to cast a reflection at that angle. But there it was, still visible, in the water, still smiling, still waving. "This isn't real," Kamari said aloud. Her voice sounded small in the vast forest. "This is stress, or dehydration, or—" Her reflection put a finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. Then it pointed at Kamari with a slow, deliberate motion, and mouthed words Kamari couldn't hear, but could read on those familiar lips. 3 days. Kamari ran. She crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over roots, didn't stop until she reached her campsite. She grabbed her phone, desperately hoping for even one bar of signal. Nothing. She was miles from the trailhead, miles from civilization, alone in wilderness with something that wore her face and lived in the water. Pack up, leave, get out. These thoughts pounded through her mind as she stuffed her sleeping bag into its compression sack with shaking hands. She could hike out today, be back to her car by evening, drive straight home, and never think about this place again. She didn't need 3 days in the woods. One night was plenty. But as she rolled her tent, she hesitated. What was she doing? Running from a weird reflection, from water that played tricks with light. She was an educated woman, a logical person who dealt in code and algorithms. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe the creek had unusual mineral content that affected how light refracted. Maybe she'd accidentally taken some medication that caused hallucinations. Maybe she was having a mental health episode and needed to recognize it as such. Kamari forced herself to breathe slowly, to think logically. If she was having a break from reality, running through the forest alone wasn't the answer. She needed to stay calm, stay put, and wait it out. The reflection couldn't hurt her. It was just an image in water. She'd finish her planned trip, hike out tomorrow as scheduled, and see a doctor when she got home if the hallucinations continued. She unpacked her tent and set it up again. Spent the day in camp, deliberately avoiding the creek. She read a book, wrote in her journal, ate dinner, and went to bed early. She didn't look at the water once. If she didn't observe the phenomenon, maybe it would stop occurring. Maybe her mind would reset and everything would return to normal. The second night she dreamed of drowning. Not panicked drowning, but slow and peaceful, sinking into clear water, while a version of herself stood on the bank above, waving goodbye with her smile. Kamari woke, gasping in darkness, tangled in her sleeping bag, moonlight streaming through the tent fabric. She lay still for long minutes, listening to the forest sounds, trying to calm her racing heart. No signal on her phone. Still alone. still in the wilderness with one more day before her scheduled exit. Wait. She'd only planned a 3-day trip. She'd arrived 2 days ago. That meant she'd seen the reflection 2 days ago. The reflection had said 3 days. 2 days were gone. 1 day remained. Kamari sat up, fully awake now, fear spreading through her chest like cold water. She was being ridiculous. Reflections didn't predict futures or issue threats. This was her own anxiety manifesting as paranoia. She needed to calm down, get through one more night, and hike out in the morning. Everything would be fine, but she couldn't fall back asleep. She lay in her tent listening to the creek burble past, sounding almost like voices, almost like laughter. When dawn finally came, she emerged exhausted and shaky. One more day. Just get through one more day. She couldn't avoid the creek. It was her only water source. She approached it cautiously in full daylight, filled her water bottles quickly without looking at the surface, and retreated to camp. But thirst drove her back at noon, and when she knelt to filter more water, she couldn't help but glance down. Her reflection looked tired, pale, exhausted in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. It stared at her with hollow eyes, no longer smiling, and mouthed a single word. Tonight. Kamari dropped her water bottle. It fell into the creek and was swept downstream. She didn't retrieve it. She ran back to camp, threw everything into her pack with no regard for organization, and started hiking out immediately. Forget the schedule. Forget the planned route. She needed to leave this place now, before nightfall, before whatever tonight meant could happen. The hike out should have taken 4 hours. Kamari pushed herself to do it in 3, practically jogging on the trail, her pack bouncing painfully against her back. The forest seemed darker than it should be for midday, the trees pressing closer, the trail twisting in ways she didn't remember from the hike in. But she kept moving, kept pushing, desperation fueling her speed. She reached the trailhead as sunset approached. Her car sat alone in the parking lot, exactly where she'd left it. Kamari had never been so happy to see a vehicle in her life. She threw her pack in the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Safe. She was safe. Just a short drive back to civilization, back to reality, back to a world where reflections behaved normally. But before starting the engine, she glanced at the rearview mirror to check the road behind her, and froze. Her reflection in the mirror was still in the forest. She could see trees behind it, see the trailhead, see the parking lot from a different angle. The reflection stood outside the car, pressed against the driver's side window, palms flat against the glass, smiling that same knowing smile from 3 days ago. Kamari turned to look directly at her window. Nothing there, just empty air and late afternoon light. She looked back at the rearview mirror. The reflection remained, mouthing words. "Let me in." "No," Kamari whispered. "You're not real. You can't be real." The reflection's smile widened. Then it did something that made Kamari's blood turn to ice. It pressed harder against the window, and the glass began to ripple, like water, like a still pool disturbed by motion. The reflection's hand pushed through the rippling glass, reaching into the car's interior, fingers stretching toward Kamari's shoulder. Kamari screamed and lunged for the passenger door. She fell out onto the pavement, scrambled to her feet, and ran. Not toward the road. There was no time. The thing would catch her before she made it 100 yards. Instead, she ran back toward the trailhead, back into the forest, because at least there she understood the rules. In the forest, the reflection lived in water. In the car, it had found a new kind of mirror, a new way to cross over. She heard footsteps behind her. Not running. Walking with calm confidence, the sound of boots on packed earth matching her stride, never falling behind no matter how fast she ran, and between her own gasping breaths she heard humming. Someone humming a tune she recognized because she hummed it herself sometimes when she was working. Her own voice, coming from behind her, getting closer. Kamari burst back into the campsite she'd abandoned hours earlier. The tent was gone. She'd packed it. But the fire ring remained, the flattened patch of earth where she'd slept. And there, beside the creek, stood a figure in hiking clothes, identical to hers. It had its back turned, kneeling at the water's edge, doing something Kamari couldn't quite see. The footsteps behind her stopped. Kamari turned slowly. Another figure stood on the trail, also wearing her clothes, her face, her body. It smiled. 3 days, it said in her voice. You took 3 days to understand. Now it's time. The figure by the creek stood and turned. Same face, same smile. We've been waiting, it said. Opal Creek makes reflections. So many reflections over so many years. And eventually reflections want to be more than images. We want to breathe, to walk, to live. More figures emerged from the forest. 5, 10, 20. All wearing Kamari's face with slight variations. Different expressions, different postures, but unmistakably her. They formed a circle around her, and as the last light faded from the sky, Kamari realized she couldn't remember which one of them she'd been 3 days ago, couldn't remember which reflection was original and which was copy. They all felt equally real, equally her. The figures began to move toward the creek, not threatening, just walking calmly to the water's edge, and Kamari found herself walking with them, compelled by something she couldn't name. They knelt together at the still pool. 20 faces looked down at 20 reflections. Or maybe 20 reflections looked up at 20 faces. Kamari couldn't tell anymore which side of the surface she occupied. One by one, the figures lay down in the shallow water. It should have been cold, uncomfortable, impossible to submerge in 12 inches of creek, but somehow they sank. Down through impossible depth, through water that was also mirror, into a place where reflections lived and originals came to die, or trade places, or simply forget which they'd ever been. Kamari felt the water close over her face. It wasn't drowning. It was returning, going back to where reflections wait for their chance to surface, to be seen, to wave at the next person who kneels at Opal Creek's edge and sees something in the water smile when they're not smiling at all. 3 days after Kamari was reported missing, search and rescue found her car at the trailhead, doors locked, keys in the ignition. Her packed gear sat in the trunk, everything accounted for except her water bottles. They searched the forest for a week, combed every trail, checked every campsite. They found no trace of her, but hikers who visit Opal Creek sometimes report strange things, reflections that move wrong, faces in the water that look familiar even though they're certain they're alone. And occasionally, someone finds a campsite that shows signs of recent use. Fire ring still warm, ground still compressed from a tent, but no one there except 20 identical sets of boot prints leading to the creek's edge and disappearing into water too shallow to drown in. When the forest fire smoke rolls in from the Tillamook burn decades after the flames died, locals know to lock their doors and ignore any voices calling from the haze. Lennox made the mistake of answering when he heard his dead brother screaming for help through the gray. Lennox had moved to the Tillamook State Forest area 6 months ago, renting a small cabin on the edge of what locals called the burn. The massive wildfires of 1933, 1939, 1945, and 1951 had destroyed over 350,000 acres of old-growth forest, leaving a scarred landscape that had slowly regenerated over the decades. Now it was beautiful second-growth forest, hiking trails, and quiet rural communities. Lennox, a freelance writer from Seattle, had come here seeking solitude to finish his novel. He'd been warned about the smoke. Not wildfire smoke, those were monitored and reported immediately. This was different. Phantom smoke, the woman at the general store had called it. Comes maybe twice a year, always in autumn. Looks like fog but smells like burning wood. Don't go outside when it comes. And whatever you do, don't answer if you hear voices. Lennox had nodded politely, filed it away as colorful local superstition, and promptly forgotten about it. He'd been too focused on his deadline, too absorbed in his manuscript about a man haunted by guilt over a death he couldn't prevent. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was writing about guilt because he understood it intimately. His younger brother Carter had died 3 years ago in a climbing accident. Lennox had been supposed to go on that trip, had canceled at the last minute for a work commitment. Carter went anyway with other friends. He fell. He died. And Lennox had been living with that what-if ever since. October arrived with cold rain and early darkness. Lennox worked late most nights, his cabin windows glowing against the black forest. The only light for miles. He liked the isolation, liked the way the trees pressed close around his small clearing, liked the silence that let him think, let him write, let him exist without the constant reminders of normal life. The smoke came on a Tuesday evening. Lennox was making coffee when he noticed the light outside his kitchen window had changed. Not darker, just different. Gray, dense. He stepped onto his porch and stopped, coffee cup halfway to his lips. Thick smoke rolled through the forest, moving between the trees like something alive, like something with purpose. It smelled strongly of burning wood, pine resin, and something else he couldn't identify. Something organic and wrong. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. His breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The smoke moved closer, tendrils reaching toward his cabin like fingers testing a surface. Lennox backed toward his door, unease prickling his spine. This wasn't normal fog. This wasn't anything natural. Then he heard the voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, calling out from the smoke. Men's voices, mostly shouting warnings, calling for help, screaming names, the sounds of panic, of people trying to escape something terrible. Lennox's rational mind tried to supply explanations. Wind through the trees, distant traffic, his own imagination. But he knew none of those were right. These were voices. Human voices. Coming from the smoke that smelled like a forest fire from decades past. He went inside and locked the door. Pulled the curtains. Turned on every light in the cabin to push back the gray, pressing against his windows. He tried to return to his manuscript, but couldn't concentrate. The voices continued outside, rising and falling in waves of desperation. He put in earbuds, played music loud enough to drown out the sound. It helped. A little. Hours passed. Lennox dozed in his chair, jerking awake periodically to check the windows. The smoke remained, thick and impenetrable, turning his world into a small island of light surrounded by churning gray. He was checking the time, nearly midnight, when he heard a voice that made his blood freeze. Lennox. Lennox, help me, please. Carter's voice, his dead brother's voice, coming from the smoke outside, screaming his name with the same terror Lennox imagined he must have felt, falling from that cliff face 3 years ago. Lennox, I'm lost. I can't see. The smoke is too thick. Please, I need help. Lennox's hands were shaking. This wasn't real. Carter was dead, buried, gone. This was some trick of the smoke, some acoustic phenomenon that made random sounds seem like familiar voices. He knew this. He understood this logically. But the voice kept calling, kept begging, kept saying his name with such desperate need that Lennox felt tears streaming down his face. I'm scared, Lennox. I can't breathe. Where are you? Lennox stood at the door, hand on the knob, every instinct screaming at him to go help his brother, to do what he'd failed to do 3 years ago, to not let Carter down again. The local woman's warning echoed faintly. Don't answer if you hear voices. But this was Carter. This was his little brother, who'd looked up to him, who'd wanted to be like him, who died while Lennox sat in a meeting about marketing strategies. His hand turned the knob. The door opened. The smoke poured in like water, cold and acrid, filling his lungs with the smell of burning trees and something else. Burning flesh, he realized with horror. This was what the great fires had smelled like. This was the smell of people caught in the inferno, of loggers and firefighters and settlers who'd been overtaken by flames that moved faster than anyone could run. Carter, Lennox called into the gray. Where are you? Here. I'm here. Follow my voice. Lennox stepped off his porch into the smoke. It was so thick he couldn't see his own feet. The cold bit through his clothes immediately, A cold that had nothing to do with October temperatures and everything to do with something fundamentally wrong with this smoke. He took another step, then another, moving away from the faint glow of his cabin lights, moving toward his brother's voice. "Keep coming. I can hear you. You're getting closer." Lennox walked through the smoke-choked forest, hands outstretched, touching tree trunks to orient himself. The voices of the others grew louder. Dozens of men calling out, pleading for help, warning each other about the flames. But there were no flames, just endless gray smoke and cold that sank into his bones. "Carter, keep talking. I'm trying to find you." "I'm right here, Lennox. Right here, just a little farther." But the voice never got closer. No matter how far Lennox walked, Carter's voice remained the same distance away. Always just ahead, always just out of reach. Lennox's logical mind tried to reassert itself. This was wrong. This was a trap. He needed to turn back. But his grief-soaked heart kept pushing him forward. This time he wouldn't fail. This time he'd save his brother. He walked for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time behaved strangely in the smoke. His sense of direction vanished. He couldn't tell which way he'd come from, couldn't see the cabin lights anymore, couldn't see anything but churning gray and the occasional dark shape of a tree looming out of the haze. Then the screaming started. Not Carter's voice. Other voices. The dozens of voices that had been calling out suddenly unified into a chorus of terror. They screamed about fire, about being surrounded, about the heat and the flames and nowhere to run. Lennox felt heat too, though he could see no fire. The air temperature spiked from freezing to furnace hot in seconds. Sweat broke out across his skin. The smoke thickened, no longer cold but scorching, searing his lungs with each breath. "Carter!" Lennox shouted, coughing. "Carter, what's happening?" His brother's voice changed. The fear drained out of it, replaced by something flat and hollow. "You came," Carter said. "You actually came. You never came for me when it mattered, but you came for this." "What?" "Carter, I don't understand." "I'm not Carter, Lennox. Carter's dead, has been for 3 years. You know that. But the smoke knows your guilt, knows what you'd do anything to fix, so it uses that. Uses the voices of the dead to call the living into the burn." The heat intensified. Lennox could feel his skin blistering, could smell his hair singing. But still there was no visible fire, just smoke and heat, and the terrible realization that he'd walked into a trap baited with his own grief. "The fires never really went out," the thing with Carter's voice continued. "They're still burning somewhere beneath the surface, still hungry, still needing fuel. And when the smoke comes up, it brings the voices of everyone who burned. And we call to the living. We call to the ones who feel guilty, who feel responsible, who would do anything for one more chance. And they come. They always come." Lennox tried to run but couldn't tell which. Direction was safe. The smoke was everywhere. The heat was everywhere. And now he could see shapes moving through the gray. Human-shaped silhouettes, dozens of them, closing in from all sides. They were burning. He could see flames dancing across their forms, even though they cast no light. Walking torches of people who died in the great fires, still burning, still suffering, reaching out for him with charred hands. "We were alone when we burned," Carter's voice said. And now Lennox could see the shape that spoke, a figure engulfed in flames, wearing his brother's face but twisted by fire and rage and endless pain. "We screamed, and no one came. We called for help, and the smoke swallowed our voices. But now we can call others. Now we don't burn alone." The burning figures grabbed Lennox. Their hands were hot enough to melt skin, to char bone. He screamed as they pulled him down into smoke that was also fire, that was also the earth itself opening up to swallow him. He could feel himself burning from the inside out, could feel his lungs scorching with each breath of superheated air. The last thing he heard before the fire took him completely was Carter's voice. The real Carter's voice, not the thing that had lured him out, saying what he'd said the last time they'd spoken. "Love you, bro. See you on the trail." But Lennox would never see any trail again. He'd found his brother, or something wearing his brother's voice, and now he was burning with all the others who'd been caught in the Tillamook fires over the decades, their deaths feeding an inferno that never truly died, that still smoldered somewhere deep in the earth, waiting for the smoke to rise and the voices to call. They found Lennox's cabin abandoned 3 days later when his landlord came to check on unpaid rent. The door stood open. Lights were on. His laptop sat on the desk, with his manuscript still open to the last sentence he'd written. Guilt is a fire that never stops burning. The search lasted 2 weeks. They found no trace of him in the surrounding forest. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of animal attack or foul play. He'd simply vanished into the trees. The official report listed him as a missing person, possibly lost in the forest, possibly suffering from some mental health crisis that led him to walk away from his life. But the locals knew better. They'd seen the smoke that Tuesday night, had locked their doors, and ignored the voices calling from the gray. And some of them swear that on quiet autumn evenings when the phantom smoke rolls through, they can hear a new voice among the chorus of the burning dead. A voice calling out a name. Carter. Carter, where are you? I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry. The Tillamook burn keeps its victims. The great fires of 1933, 1939, 1945, and 1951 are historical facts, documented and studied. But what the history books don't mention is that some fires never truly go out. They just burn deeper, burn slower, burn in places where smoke can rise and voices can call and guilt can lure the living into flames that exist in memory and pain and the endless hunger of a forest that remembers when it died. And twice a year, maybe 3 times if the conditions are right, the smoke comes rolling through the regenerated forest, gray and thick and smelling of burning wood. The locals lock their doors. They ignore the voices. They know better than to answer when the dead call out using the voices of people you loved, people you failed, people you'd do anything to save. But there's always someone new, someone who doesn't believe the stories, someone whose guilt runs deep enough that they'd walk into any danger for a chance at redemption. And the smoke is patient. The fire is patient. They've been burning for almost a century. They can wait. You know that feeling when you're crossing a high bridge and something whispers, "What if you just turned the wheel?" At Crooked River Gorge, that whisper has a voice, a face, and hands that reach through your car window to help you do it. Nyla learned this when a hitchhiker she'd never picked up appeared in her passenger seat halfway across. Nyla had been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing through fatigue to reach Bend, where her sister was giving birth to her first child. The route took her through Central Oregon's high desert, a landscape of juniper trees and red rock and vast empty spaces. She'd made this drive dozens of times, knew every turn, every landmark. The Crooked River Gorge Bridge was always her favorite part, a steel arch spanning a dramatic canyon, the river a thin ribbon of silver, 300 feet below. It was just past midnight when she approached the bridge. The road was empty, her headlights the only illumination for miles. Nyla had the radio on, some late-night talk show host discussing conspiracy theories, background noise to keep her alert. She wasn't paying much attention until the host's voice suddenly cut out, replaced by static, then silence. Her phone showed no signal. Normal for this area. The radio stayed dead. Also, not unusual, reception was spotty in the gorge. But then her headlights flickered, dimmed, and in that moment of reduced visibility, someone appeared in her passenger seat. Nyla screamed and jerked the wheel. The car swerved, tires squealing, nearly hitting the bridge railing before she corrected. She slammed on the brakes, heart hammering, and turned to look at the intruder. It was a man, maybe 40 years old, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, looking completely ordinary, except for 2 things. Nyla had definitely not picked up any hitchhikers, and she could see through him. Not completely transparent, but translucent, like he was there, but not quite solid. "Keep driving," he said calmly. Don't stop on the bridge. Never stop on the bridge. Who the hell are you? How did you... Nyla's hands shook on the steering wheel. Get out. Get out of my car. I can't get out. And neither can you. Not until we cross. So drive. His voice was urgent now, losing the calm. Drive before they notice you've stopped. Before who notices? But even as Nyla asked, she saw movement in her rearview mirror. Figures walking onto the bridge behind her car. Dozens of them, appearing from nowhere, all moving with purposeful strides toward her vehicle. Some wore modern clothes. Others wore styles from different decades. All of them had the same translucent quality as the man in her passenger seat. Nyla's foot found the accelerator. The car lurched forward. The bridge was maybe 500 feet long. It should take seconds to cross. But as she drove, she realized the far end wasn't getting closer. The bridge stretched ahead of her, lengthening impossibly, the opposite side remaining the same distance away, no matter how fast she went. What's happening? Nyla's voice came out strangled. This isn't possible. The bridge doesn't want to let you go, the man said. He was looking behind them at the approaching figures. It does this sometimes. Catches someone. Usually people who are thinking too hard about the drop, about how easy it would be to just turn the wheel and fly out into space. Were you thinking about that? Nyla's breath caught. She had been. Not seriously, just the intrusive thought everyone gets on high bridges. That moment of vertigo where your brain shows you what would happen if you just stopped being careful. She'd thought about it for maybe 2 seconds before dismissing it. But apparently, that was enough. The bridge feeds on that, the man continued. On the morbid curiosity, the dark impulses, the tiny part of everyone that wonders what it would feel like to fall. And when it catches someone having those thoughts, it tries to make them reality. The figures behind them were getting closer. Nyla could see their faces now in the rearview mirror, some desperate, some angry, some completely blank. They walked with unnatural speed, covering ground faster than should be possible. And ahead, the bridge kept extending, the endpoint receding. I'm Oliver, the man said. I got caught by the bridge in 1987. Been trying to help people cross ever since. Most of the others. He gestured at the approaching crowd. They've given up helping. Now they just try to pull new people in, make them crash, make them part of the bridge forever. How do I get across? Nyla's speedometer read 70 near merit, but the bridge showed no signs of ending. How do I escape? You have to stop thinking about the fall, stop imagining it. The bridge extends as long as you're feeding it fear and curiosity about the drop. You need to focus on something else, something that has nothing to do with falling, or dying, or the void. Nyla tried to think about her sister, about the baby being born, about happy memories, but her eyes kept darting to the railing, to the 300-foot drop just beyond the metal barrier. Every time she looked, the bridge stretched longer. The figures behind her got closer. Their hands reached out toward her car, fingers scraping against the trunk. Don't look at the edge, Oliver shouted. Don't think about it. Tell me about your sister. Talk to me. Fill your head with words so there's no room for the intrusive thoughts. Nyla started talking, rambling, telling Oliver about her sister Maya, about how they'd grown up in Portland, about childhood memories and inside jokes, and the time they'd gotten lost at the state fair. She talked about Maya's husband, about the nursery they'd painted, about the name they'd chosen for the baby. She talked and talked, filling the silence with words, forcing her mind away from the drop, from the fall, from the morbid fascination that had gotten her caught. The bridge began to shorten, slowly at first, then faster. The far end came, into view, actual solid ground beyond the span. The figures behind her fell back, unable to keep pace now that the bridge was releasing its grip. Some of them screamed in frustration, others just faded back into transparency, disappearing into the structure itself. Nyla's car shot off the bridge onto normal road. The extension ended abruptly. She was across on solid ground, The bridge behind her looking perfectly normal in her rearview mirror. Just a standard 500-foot span. Nothing supernatural about it at all. Oliver was still in her passenger seat. He looked relieved. "You made it. Most people don't. Most people can't stop thinking about the fall. They feed the bridge their fear until they crash, or just become part of it." Nyla pulled over onto the shoulder, hands shaking too badly to keep driving. "What are you? What is that bridge?" "I told you. I got caught in 1987. Was driving across, thinking about how high it was, imagining what would happen if I swerved. The bridge extended. I panicked. Crashed into the railing. Car went over." He said it matter-of-factly, like describing someone else's death. "But part of me stayed. The part that was still thinking about the fall when I died. That part got trapped in the bridge's hunger. And the others? Same story. Different years. The bridge has been catching people since it opened in 1926. Everyone who's ever had that intrusive thought while crossing. Everyone who's fed the bridge their morbid curiosity. Some of them make it across, but some of them crash, and parts of them stay trapped. We exist in the bridge's hunger, in the moment between thinking about falling and actually falling." Nyla looked at him, really looked at him. He seemed so solid now, so real. "Why did you help me?" "The others were trying to make me crash." Oliver smiled sadly. "Because I remember what it felt like to be caught. I remember the terror. And I remember that someone tried to help me. A figure that appeared in my car, told me to stop thinking about the drop. I didn't listen. I was too scared, too focused on the fall. But I try to do for others what that person tried to do for me. Sometimes it works. Tonight it worked." "Thank you," Nyla whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you'd have crashed. Your car would have gone over the railing. You'd have fallen 300 feet into the gorge. And part of you, the part that was thinking about falling, would have stayed with the bridge forever, trying to pull others in, trying to make them share your fate." Oliver's translucent form was starting to fade. "I have to go back now. The bridge only lets me out when someone needs help. But you're safe. You crossed. Just don't come back here. Don't drive this road again. The bridge remembers everyone who's ever fed it. If you cross again, it'll be easier for it to catch you." "Wait." Nyla reached out, but her hand passed through his fading shoulder. "Will you ever be free? Will you ever actually cross?" Oliver was almost completely transparent now, just an outline sitting in her passenger seat. "Maybe. If I help enough people cross, if I work against the bridge's hunger enough times, maybe eventually it'll let me go. Or maybe I'll fade completely and just become part of the structure. I don't know. But tonight you made it. That's what matters." He disappeared. Nyla sat alone in her car on the dark highway shoulder, the crooked river gorge bridge visible in her mirror, looking perfectly innocent and beautiful in the moonlight. Just a bridge. Just steel and concrete spanning a canyon. Nothing supernatural. Nothing hungry. Except she knew better now. She knew about the figures trapped in its span, the ones who'd thought too hard about falling and fed the bridge their fear. She knew about Oliver, helping people cross for 38 years, trying to work off his own moment of morbid curiosity that had cost him his life. She knew that intrusive thoughts had weight, had power, could feed things that existed in the spaces between imagination and reality. Nyla started her car and drove the rest of the way to Bend, using a different route that added 45 minutes but avoided the crooked river gorge entirely. She made it in time to see her nephew born, held him in the hospital while her exhausted sister slept, told Maya nothing about what had happened on the bridge because who would believe it? But sometimes, late at night, Nyla thinks about Oliver, wonders if he's still there, still appearing in passenger seats of cars that get caught by the bridge's hunger, still trying to help people cross. Wonders how many people he's saved. Wonders if saving enough people will ever be enough to let him finish his own crossing. And she never, ever drives across the crooked river gorge bridge again, because the bridge remembers. And next time, Oliver might not be there to help. Next time, she might not be able to stop thinking about the fall. Next time, her car might go over the railing, and part of her would stay, trapped in that moment of morbid curiosity, reaching out to pull others in, making them share the fate she'd barely escaped. The Crooked River Gorge Bridge still stands, beautiful and functional, carrying traffic across the canyon every day. And most people cross without incident, their momentary thoughts about the height and the drop too fleeting to feed the bridge's hunger. But some people, the ones who think too long, who imagine too vividly, who feed their intrusive thoughts instead of dismissing them, some people find the bridge extending beneath them, stretching impossibly long, while figures appear in their mirrors and their passenger seats, some trying to help, most trying to pull them into crashes that will make them part of the bridge forever. And on clear nights when the moon is bright, if you look carefully while crossing, you might see translucent figures standing along the railings. Most of them are trying to make you swerve, make you crash, make you join them. But one of them, a man in a flannel shirt from 1987, is trying to help you cross safely, trying to save you the way he wishes someone had saved him. One driver at a time, hoping that eventually enough good deeds will let him finish his own journey across the bridge he's been trapped on for almost 40 years. Sometimes archaeological discoveries should stay buried, especially when they've been sleeping for 10,000 years, and wake up hungry for the warmth they lost to an ancient winter. Sienna's research team disturbed something in Fort Rock Cave that had been waiting in frozen darkness since the last ice age, and it followed them home in their equipment. Sienna was a graduate student in archaeology at the University of Oregon, specializing in Paleo-Indian sites. For 2 years, she'd been lobbying to get access to Fort Rock Cave for a new excavation. The site was famous. In 1938, archaeologists had discovered sagebrush bark sandals there, carbon dated to over 10,000 years old, some of the oldest footwear ever found in North America. But there had been no major digs since the 1960s, and Sienna believed there was more to discover in the cave's deeper layers. She finally got permission in October. A small team, Sienna, 2 other grad students named Araya and Mateo, and their faculty advisor, Dr. Chen, drove out to the Fort Rock Basin in Lake County, where the massive volcanic tuff ring rose from the desert floor like a broken crown. The cave itself was a shallow alcove in the rock formation's eastern side, protected from the elements, perfect for ancient peoples seeking shelter. They set up their equipment on the first day. Ground-penetrating radar, photography lights, excavation tools, sample containers. The cave was bigger than Sienna had expected, extending back into the rock farther than the early excavations had documented. Dr. Chen marked out a grid, and they began carefully removing layers of sediment, cataloging everything they found: animal bones, stone tools, charcoal from ancient fires. On the 3rd day, Sienna's trowel hit something hard about 4 feet down. She called the others over. Working carefully, they exposed what looked like a bundle wrapped in animal hides, preserved by the cave's dry conditions. It was maybe 3 feet long, tightly bound with sinew that had somehow remained intact for millennia. "Don't open it here," Dr. Chen said. "We need to get it back to the lab, document it properly, run tests before we disturb the contents." But Sienna was already carefully cutting the bindings, unable to resist. The hide wrapping fell away, revealing what was inside: a human infant, or what had been an infant 10,000 years ago, perfectly preserved by the cold and dryness, skin like leather, tiny hands curled into fists, eyes closed. It wore a small garment made of woven plant fibers, and was surrounded by grave goods: shell beads, a small stone pendant, a perfect obsidian blade no bigger than Sienna's thumb. "A burial," Araya whispered. "They buried a baby here with ceremony, with love." Something about the bundle felt wrong to Sienna. The bindings had been too tight, too elaborate. Not like protecting something precious, but like containing something dangerous. She touched the infant's hand, and snatched her fingers back. The mummified flesh was ice cold, colder than the surrounding sediment, colder than anything natural. Dr. Chen insisted they package everything carefully and transport it back to Eugene immediately. Something about the find made him uneasy too, though he couldn't articulate why. They loaded the bundle and all their equipment into the university van as sunset painted the desert red and gold. The drive back took 4 hours. Sienna sat in the back seat with the carefully packed bundle, unable to stop looking at it. The temperature in the van kept dropping despite the heater running full blast. Her breath fogged. Ice crystals formed on the windows. Mateo, driving, kept adjusting the controls, muttering about the van's climate system malfunctioning. Halfway back to Eugene, Sienna heard crying, soft, muffled, coming from the bundle. She looked at the others, but no one else seemed to hear it. The crying continued. Not the wail of a distressed infant, but something sadder, lonelier. The sound of something that had been alone in the dark for 10,000 years. "Do you guys hear that?" Sienna asked. "Hear what?" Araya turned around from the front passenger seat. "Nothing. Never mind." But the crying continued, and now Sienna could feel the bundle moving slightly, the ancient wrappings shifting as if whatever was inside was trying to get out. They reached Eugene near midnight and unloaded everything into the archaeology lab, a basement facility in the science building. Dr. Chen insisted they all go home, get sleep, and start fresh in the morning with proper documentation protocols. But Sienna volunteered to stay and begin preliminary cataloging. She wanted to understand what they'd found, needed to understand why the bundle felt so wrong. Alone in the lab, surrounded by fluorescent lights and steel examination tables, Sienna carefully unwrapped the bundle again. The infant looked exactly as it had in the cave, mummified, preserved, ancient. But its position had changed. She was certain of it. The hands that had been curled into fists were now reaching upward, fingers slightly splayed as if grasping for something. The temperature in the lab plummeted. Sienna's breath came out in clouds. The overhead lights flickered, and the infant's eyes opened. They were black, completely black. No whites, no irises, just darkness that seemed to absorb light. The tiny mouth opened, and that crying sound emerged again, louder now, echoing off the lab's tile walls. The infant sat up, ancient joints creaking, mummified skin cracking, and reached toward Sienna with hands that were no longer small and helpless, but clawed and grasping. Sienna stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of cataloging tools. "You're not real. You're not alive. You've been dead for 10,000 years. The thing that had been an infant spoke. Its voice was wind through empty caves, the creak of glaciers, the sound of winter itself given form. Hungry. So hungry. Cold for so long. Need warmth. Need life. It climbed off the examination table with jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet controlled by someone learning how joints worked. The temperature dropped further. Ice formed on the steel tables, the computer screens, the jars of samples. Everything in the lab began to freeze. Sienna ran for the door. It wouldn't open. The lock had frozen solid, ice crystals spreading across the metal mechanism. She pounded on it, screaming, but the basement lab was soundproofed, and it was past midnight. No one would hear her. The creature approached slowly, savoring her fear. Tribe left me in the cave. Said I was wrong, born during the long winter, when the sun forgot to come back. Born cold, born hungry. They couldn't kill me, so they bound me, left me in the dark, hoped I would sleep forever. What are you? Sienna backed against the door, nowhere left to run. I am what winter makes when it wants a child. I am ice-given flesh. I am the cold that takes warmth from living things. The creature was close now, reaching up with those clawed hands. You woke me. You cut my bindings. You brought me into a world of warmth and life. And I am so very hungry. Its fingers touched Sienna's ankle. The cold was instant and agonizing, spreading up her leg like frostbite accelerated 1,000 times. She screamed and kicked, connecting with the creature's chest. It fell back, but didn't seem hurt, just inconvenienced. The place where Sienna had kicked it left her foot numb and blue. The creature laughed, a sound like ice breaking. Your warmth tastes like summer, like fire, like everything I never had. It advanced again. Sienna grabbed the obsidian blade from the examination table, the one that had been buried with the creature. It was still ice cold, but she held it anyway, pointing it at the approaching thing. "Stay back." The creature paused. "You hold my death. The blade they made to kill me, obsidian from the volcano, shaped by hands that loved me before they feared me. But they couldn't use it. Couldn't kill an infant, even one born wrong. So they bound me instead, put the blade in my wrappings as a warning to anyone who found me. A weapon and a ward, both." Sienna looked at the blade. It was beautifully made, sharp despite its age, glinting black in the flickering fluorescent lights. "If this can kill you, stay away from me or I'll use it." "You won't. Humans never do. You're too curious, too compassionate. You see something that looks like a child, and you hesitate." The creature moved closer. "That's why we hunt you so easily." But the creature was wrong. Sienna had spent 2 years studying Paleo-Indian peoples, learning about their survival in a harsh Ice Age world. They hadn't been soft. They'd been practical, doing what was necessary to protect their tribes. If they'd bound this thing instead of killing it, it was because the blade required something, a sacrifice, a cost that they hadn't been willing to pay. Sienna looked at the blade again. Obsidian. Volcanic glass. Formed in fire, used to contain ice. She understood suddenly what the cost would be. As the creature reached for her, Sienna drove the blade into her own palm. The pain was shocking, immediate. Blood welled up, hot and red, dripping onto the ancient blade, and the obsidian began to glow, not with light, but with heat, warming in her hand until it felt like holding a coal from a fire. "No." The creature stumbled back. "No, you don't understand what you're—" Sienna thrust the blade forward, into the creature's chest. There was no resistance, no flesh or bone, just cold air and darkness that the blade pierced easily. The creature screamed, a sound of wind and winter dying. Heat spread from the blade, from Sienna's blood on the obsidian, radiating outward through the thing's mummified form. It burned. Not with flame, but with warmth itself, with summer and sun and life. The ice child that had been sleeping for 10,000 years cracked and crumbled, unable to withstand the heat that Sienna's living blood had awakened in the ancient weapon. The creature fell apart into dust and fragments of ancient hide, leaving only the obsidian blade on the floor, still warm, still stained with Sienna's blood. The lab's temperature normalized. The ice melted. The door lock unfroze. Sienna collapsed against the wall, wrapping her bleeding hand in a lab towel, shaking from shock and pain and relief. When Dr. Chen arrived in the morning, he found Sienna still there, sitting on the floor surrounded by the scattered remains of the burial. She told him everything, knowing he wouldn't believe her, knowing it sounded insane. But the evidence was there, the destroyed mummy, the warm blade, her injured hand, the ice damage throughout the lab. They never published their findings from Fort Rock Cave. The university quietly archived everything, citing contamination during transport. The obsidian blade went into locked storage, labeled only with a catalog number and a warning that it required a blood offering to activate. Sienna finished her degree but switched specializations to historical archaeology. Nothing older than a few hundred years. She'd learned her lesson about disturbing ancient burials. But sometimes she dreams about the cave, about other bundles buried deeper in the sediment, wrapped tight with elaborate bindings, placed there by peoples who knew things about the world that modern science had forgotten. About other Ice Age children, born wrong, bound in darkness, waiting for someone curious enough to cut their restraints and set them free. Fort Rock Cave is still there, open to the public for hiking and viewing, but the deeper chambers are restricted, marked off limits for preservation purposes, and that's probably for the best. Well, because some archaeological discoveries aren't treasures. Some are warnings, some are prisons, and some should stay buried forever, sleeping in the cold darkness where ancient peoples put them, bound with love and terror, and the knowledge that some hungers can never be satisfied, only contained. If you enjoyed this chilling tale from Oregon's haunted history, don't forget to subscribe to Haunted Fears for more terrifying true stories and urban legends. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which Oregon location scared you the most, and turn on